There exists, in the vast cartography of human consciousness, a territory that few dare to map, a liminal realm where the ordinary world dissolves into something far more mysterious and alive. Here, at the threshold between the known and the unknowable, dwell those souls who experience reality not as a fixed construct, but as a living, breathing entity that speaks in whispers only they can hear. These are the highly sensitive ones, the natural mystics among us, who carry within their very being an ancient remembering of what it means to feel the world in its fullest expression. Carl Jung, that great navigator of the human psyche, understood that sensitivity is not a modern affliction but an archetypal gift, a particular constellation of consciousness that has existed since humanity first gazed up at the stars and wondered about their place in the cosmic order. Like the shamans of old who stood between worlds, serving as bridges between the material and the spiritual, the highly sensitive person exists in a state of perpetual liminality, forever poised on the edge of revelation. To understand this gift, we must first acknowledge the profound misunderstanding that surrounds it in our contemporary world. We live in an age that worships the external, that values the loud over the subtle, the fast over the deep, the surface over the soul. In such a world, sensitivity becomes pathologized, labeled as weakness or dysfunction, when in truth it represents one of humanity's most precious capacities, the ability to perceive the invisible threads that connect all things. The highly sensitive person is born with what we might call thin skin between worlds, where others experience life through layers of psychological protection. The sensitive soul encounters reality with fewer barriers, less filtration, more direct contact with the raw essence of being. This is not a design flaw, but a design feature, though one that requires profound understanding and careful cultivation to reach its full potential. Imagine, if you will, standing in a vast cathedral where every whisper echoes, every footstep reverberates, every shift in light creates shadows that dance with meaning. This is the inner landscape of the highly sensitive person, a space where stimuli are not merely received but amplified, transformed, alchemized into something deeper and more nuanced than simple sensory input. They live in a world where colors have emotional textures, where sounds carry the weight of unspoken stories, where the energy of others becomes as tangible as physical touch. Jung wrote extensively about the phenomenon of participation mystique, that primitive psychological state in which the boundary between self and other, subject and object, becomes permeable and fluid. While most adults develop increasingly rigid ego boundaries as they mature, the highly sensitive person retains something of this original fluidity, this capacity to merge momentarily with the emotional atmosphere around them. This is why a sensitive child might cry when witnessing another's pain, not from sympathy alone, but from actual felt experience of that pain within their own being. This permeability extends beyond the emotional realm into all dimensions of sensory and energetic experience. The highly sensitive person notices subtleties that others miss entirely, the almost imperceptible shift in someone's voice that signals hidden distress, the way sunlight through a window creates a particular quality of melancholy, the energetic residue left in a room where conflict has occurred. They are natural detectives of the invisible world, gifted with an apparatus for perception that reads between the lines of ordinary reality. But this gift comes wrapped in a paradox that Jung would have recognized immediately, for every expansion of consciousness brings with it an equal measure of potential suffering. The same nervous system that allows the sensitive person to perceive beauty with startling clarity also makes them vulnerable to overwhelm, overstimulation, and the weight of carrying more emotional information than they sometimes know how to process. This is where we must invoke Jung's understanding of Enantiodromia, that principle of psychological compensation, where every extreme tends to produce its opposite. The very sensitivity that allows for profound depth of experience can, when unconscious or unintegrated, become a source of overwhelming chaos. The gift becomes a burden, the blessing transforms into a curse, and the sensitive person finds themselves caught in a cycle of stimulation and exhaustion that can feel endless and defeating. Yet this apparent contradiction points towards something profound about the nature of consciousness itself. Jung recognized that all psychological gifts carry within them their own shadows, their own challenges, their own requirements for conscious development. The highly sensitive person stands at a unique crossroads in human evolution, carrying within their being both the promise of expanded awareness and the responsibility for learning how to navigate that expansion with wisdom and skill. In the mythology of many cultures, we find stories of those who were chosen to serve as intermediaries between the human and divine realms. These figures, whether shamans, oracles, or mystics, were invariably portrayed as both blessed and burdened, gifted with extraordinary perception, but required to pay a price for their abilities. The oracle at Delphi channeled divine wisdom, but lived a life of service and sacrifice. The Celtic Druids could read the language of nature, but were often isolated from ordinary social life by the demands of their calling. The highly sensitive person embodies this same archetypal pattern in contemporary form. They are the natural empaths, the unconscious healers, the ones who feel the collective pain and joy of humanity flowing through their being whether they choose it or not. Like Jung's concept of the wounded healer, they carry within themselves both the capacity for profound healing and the wounds that make such healing necessary. This brings us to one of the most crucial aspects of understanding sensitivity as a spiritual and psychological phenomenon. The highly sensitive person is not simply someone who feels more, they are someone who processes experience differently at the most fundamental level. Their nervous system, their emotional apparatus, their very way of being in the world operates according to a different set of principles than those of the majority population. Research in the field of depth psychology and neuroscience has begun to validate what Jung intuited long ago, that sensitivity represents a distinct neurological and psychological profile, not a deviation from some imagined norm. The highly sensitive person's brain processes information more thoroughly, makes more connections between disparate elements, and maintains a state of heightened awareness that allows for the detection of subtle environmental changes that others miss entirely. This processing difference manifests in countless ways throughout daily life, where others might walk into a room and notice only the obvious elements, furniture, people, general atmosphere. The sensitive person unconsciously catalogues layers of information, the emotional undertones of conversations, the way light falls across surfaces, the energetic dynamics between individuals, the historical resonance of the space itself. They are living, breathing instruments of perception, constantly tuning into frequencies that exist just below the threshold of ordinary awareness. But perhaps most significantly, the highly sensitive person serves as a kind of early warning system for the collective unconscious. They feel the tremors of social and emotional upheaval before they become visible to others. They sense the undercurrents of change, the subtle shifts in the collective mood, the approaching storms in the human emotional landscape. Like canaries in coal mines, they often experience distress or discomfort as a response to toxic environments or unhealthy social dynamics long before others recognize the problem. This capacity for early detection extends into the realm of relationships as well. The highly sensitive person often knows intuitively when something is amiss in their personal connections, sensing deception, hidden emotions, or unspoken conflicts with an accuracy that can be both gift and burden. They become unwilling repositories for the projected emotions and unconscious material of others, absorbing and processing psychological content that doesn't belong to them, but nevertheless affects them profoundly. Jung understood that such individuals often serve as unconscious containers for the shadow material of their families, communities, and cultures. The sensitive child may carry the unexpressed grief of previous generations, feeling inexplicably sad without understanding why. The sensitive adult may find themselves absorbing the anxiety and stress of their workplace, coming home depleted not by their own work, but by the emotional atmosphere they've navigated throughout the day. This phenomenon points toward one of the most profound aspects of sensitivity as a spiritual calling. The highly sensitive person is often serving a function that extends far beyond their individual psychology. They are processing emotional and energetic material for the collective, serving as unconscious healers and transformers of human suffering. Like the ancient sin-eaters who would consume the transgressions of the dying, the sensitive person often finds themselves digesting the difficult emotions and energies that others cannot or will not face. Yet this service, when unconscious, can become a form of psychological martyrdom that depletes and destroys rather than heals and transforms. The key lies in developing what Jung would call conscious participation in the archetypal process. The sensitive person must learn to recognize their role not as victim of their sensitivity but as conscious participant in a profound form of human service. This recognition requires a fundamental shift in perspective from seeing sensitivity as personal burden to understanding it as archetypal calling. The highly sensitive person is not broken or flawed. They are responding to an ancient template embedded deep within the human psyche, a pattern that calls certain individuals to serve as bridges between the conscious and unconscious realms. In many wisdom traditions, such individuals were recognized and honored for their gifts, given special training and support to help them develop their capacities without being overwhelmed by them. The Tibetan concept of the tulku, the Celtic understanding of the thin places where other worlds break through, the shamanic traditions that recognize natural sensitivity as a calling to spiritual service, all point toward a deeper understanding of what it means to be highly sensitive in a human body. The modern world, with its emphasis on rational materialism and emotional suppression, has largely forgotten this wisdom. We have created a culture that not only fails to support the highly sensitive person, but actively works against their natural rhythms and needs. We reward emotional numbness, celebrate busyness over depth, and create environments that assault the sensitive nervous system with constant stimulation and demand. Yet even within this challenging context, the highly sensitive person continues to serve their ancient function. They remain the ones who notice when something is amiss, who feel the pain that others have numbed themselves against, who carry the emotional truth of situations, even when that truth is uncomfortable or unwelcome. They are the natural counselors, the intuitive healers, the ones who create safe spaces for others to feel and express what they have been unable to acknowledge. But to fulfill this role consciously and sustainably, the highly sensitive person must undertake a particular kind of psychological and spiritual development. They must learn to distinguish between their own emotions and those they absorb from others. They must develop strong, energetic boundaries while maintaining their natural empathy and openness. They must find ways to process and transform the emotional material they inevitably carry without being overwhelmed or depleted by it. This development requires what Jung called the transcendent function, the capacity to hold the tension between opposites until a new synthesis emerges. For the highly sensitive person, this means learning to be both open and protected, both feeling and detached, both engaged with the world and preserved in their essential self. It means developing what we might call conscious sensitivity, the ability to use their gifts intentionally rather than being at the mercy of them. The journey toward conscious sensitivity begins with recognition and acceptance. The highly sensitive person must first acknowledge that their way of being in the world is valid and valuable, not something to be fixed or overcome. They must learn to see their sensitivity not as weakness, but as strength, not as pathology, but as gift, not as burden, but as calling. This recognition often comes as a profound relief after years or decades of feeling like misfits in a world that seems designed for different kinds of nervous systems. Many highly sensitive people report that simply learning about the trait and understanding that they are not alone or abnormal brings a sense of homecoming that is both healing and empowering. But recognition is only the beginning. True integration of sensitivity as a spiritual and psychological gift requires ongoing practice, conscious development, and often a complete restructuring of one's relationship with the world. It means learning to honor the need for solitude and stillness, developing practices that help process and transform emotional energy, and creating environments that support rather than assault the sensitive nervous system. It also means learning to set boundaries, not walls that shut out the world, but permeable barriers that allow for conscious choice about what to absorb and what to deflect. The highly sensitive person must become a master of energetic hygiene, learning to cleanse themselves of emotional residue that doesn't belong to them while remaining open to the genuine connections and insights that their sensitivity provides. Perhaps most importantly, the development of conscious sensitivity requires a relationship with what Jung called the self, that deeper organizing principle within the psyche that transcends the ego and connects us to the larger patterns of meaning and purpose in our lives. For the highly sensitive person, this connection often feels more immediate and accessible than it does for others, but it also requires more conscious cultivation to avoid being overwhelmed by the intensity of the contact. The self serves as an anchor point for the sensitive person, a stable center around which the swirling energies of their perception can organize themselves. Through practices like meditation, dream work, active imagination, and creative expression, the highly sensitive person can develop a conscious relationship with this deeper aspect of themselves, learning to navigate their sensitivity from a place of centered awareness rather than reactive overwhelm. This inner work often reveals that sensitivity is not just a personal trait, but a connection to something larger, to the collective unconscious, to the archetypal realm, to the very heart of what it means to be human in all its complexity and contradiction. The highly sensitive person begins to understand that their capacity to feel deeply is not a burden to be endured, but a gift to be shared, not a weakness to overcome, but a strength to be developed. As this understanding deepens, the highly sensitive person often discovers that their greatest struggles contain the seeds of their greatest contributions. The very experiences that once felt overwhelming become sources of wisdom and compassion. The emotional pain they have processed becomes a capacity to help others navigate their own difficult feelings. The intensity that once felt like too much becomes a channel for profound healing and transformation. This transformation does not happen overnight, nor does it happen without conscious effort and often considerable support. The path of integrating sensitivity as a spiritual gift is lifelong work that requires patience, self-compassion, and often the guidance of others who understand the territory. But for those who undertake this journey, the rewards are profound, not just personal healing and growth, but the development of capacities that can serve the healing of the world itself. In our current historical moment, as humanity faces unprecedented challenges that require emotional intelligence, empathy, and the ability to sense subtle changes in complex systems, the gifts of the highly sensitive person have never been more needed. They are the ones who can feel the pain of the earth, who sense the emotional currents beneath social and political upheavals, who carry within their being the capacity for the deep feeling and genuine connection that our world so desperately needs. But these gifts can only be fully realized when they are consciously developed and wisely directed. The highly sensitive person must learn to be not just a receiver of emotional information, but a transformer of it, not just a carrier of others' pain, but a catalyst for healing, not just a witness to the world's suffering, but an agent of its redemption. This is the sacred task that lies before every highly sensitive person, to transform their sensitivity from unconscious burden into conscious gift, from personal challenge into collective service, from individual struggle into universal healing. It is a task that requires courage, wisdom, and often considerable support, but it is also a task that offers the possibility of profound fulfillment and meaning. As we stand on the threshold of this exploration, we recognize that the journey ahead will not be easy. We will descend into the shadow realms where sensitivity becomes overwhelm, explore the hermit's cave where solitude transforms into wisdom, and discover the oracle's burden of carrying others' emotions. But we will also find, if we have the courage to look deeply enough, that within the very heart of sensitivity lies one of humanity's most precious gifts, the capacity to feel the world so deeply that we cannot help but be transformed by it, and in being transformed, to become agents of transformation for others. The veil between worlds is thin for the highly sensitive person, and this thinness is both challenge and opportunity, burden and blessing, curse and calling. Our task is to learn to navigate this liminal space with consciousness and grace, honoring both the difficulties and the gifts it brings, and ultimately discovering that our sensitivity is not something we must overcome, but something we are called to embody with ever greater wisdom and skill. In the alchemical traditions that so fascinated Jung, there exists a phase known as the nigredo, the blackening, the descent into darkness, the necessary putrefaction that precedes all transformation. It is here, in this psychological underworld, that the highly sensitive person must eventually journey if they are to claim their gifts fully, for within the shadow of their sensitivity lies not only their greatest fears, but also their most profound potential for wisdom and healing. The shadow, as Jung understood it, is not evil but unlived, those aspects of ourselves that we have been forced to repress, deny, or project onto others because they do not fit the image we have constructed of who we should be. For the highly sensitive person, the shadow often takes the form of a deep, gnawing belief that they are fundamentally flawed, too much, too intense, too needy for a world that values emotional restraint and sensory moderation. This shadow belief does not arise in a vacuum. It is born from countless encounters with a world that does not understand or accommodate the sensitive nervous system. From earliest childhood, the highly sensitive person receives messages, sometimes subtle, sometimes overt, that their way of being in the world is problematic. They cry too easily, feel too deeply, need too much quiet, become overwhelmed too quickly. They are told to toughen up, to get thicker skin, to not be so sensitive, as if their fundamental nature were a character defect to be corrected, rather than a gift to be understood and nurtured. Each of these messages becomes a wound in the sensitive soul, a place where the natural expression of their being is met with disapproval, dismissal, or rejection. Over time, these wounds accumulate into a complex of shame and self-doubt that colors every aspect of their self-perception. They begin to see their sensitivity not as a profound capacity for depth and connection, but as evidence of their inadequacy and weakness. This shadow complex operates like a distorting lens through which the highly sensitive person views all of their experiences. When they become overwhelmed by stimulation, they do not simply acknowledge their nervous system's need for rest and restoration. They berate themselves for being weak and unable to handle what others seem to manage with ease. When they withdraw to solitude for processing and renewal, they do not honor their need for introspection. They judge themselves as antisocial and defective. The cruelest aspect of this shadow complex is how it turns the very experiences that could become sources of wisdom and strength into evidence of personal failure. The sensitive person's capacity to feel deeply becomes proof of their emotional instability. Their need for meaning and authenticity becomes evidence of their impracticality and inability to function in the real world. Their intuitive awareness of others' emotional states becomes a burden of responsibility that they feel they must carry, but can never carry adequately. This psychological constellation creates what we might call the overwhelm trap, a cyclical pattern where the highly sensitive person's natural responses to overstimulation are interpreted through the lens of shame, creating additional stress that compounds the original overwhelm. They become overwhelmed not just by external stimuli, but by their own harsh internal response to being overwhelmed. The shadow feeds on itself, growing stronger with each iteration of self-condemnation. To understand this trap fully, we must recognize that overwhelm for the highly sensitive person is not simply a matter of too much stimulation hitting their nervous system. It is a complex psychological event that involves the collision between their natural processing style and the demands of environments that were not designed with their needs in mind. When a sensitive person becomes overwhelmed, they are not failing, they are responding appropriately to inappropriate conditions. Yet the shadow whispers a different story. It tells them that everyone else seems to handle these conditions just fine, so the problem must lie within them. It points to colleagues who thrive in open office environments, friends who enjoy loud concerts and crowded parties, family members who can multitask without becoming frazzled, and asks, why can't you be like them? What's wrong with you that you need so much quiet, so much space, so much time to process? This comparison becomes a form of psychological torture for the highly sensitive person. They measure themselves against standards that were never meant for their nervous system, judging their performance by metrics that ignore their unique processing style. It would be like judging a deep-sea explorer by their ability to fly, or condemning a master violinist for their inability to play drums. The instrument is perfectly designed for its purpose, but the evaluation criteria are fundamentally mismatched. The shadow of overwhelm also carries within it deep fears about social belonging and acceptance. The highly sensitive person often becomes convinced that their needs and responses make them burdensome to others, that their intensity drives people away, that their depth of feeling makes them unsuitable for normal human relationships. They develop elaborate strategies for hiding their sensitivity, performing a version of themselves that they believe will be more acceptable to others. This performance requires enormous energy and creates a split within the psyche, a false self that attempts to meet external expectations while the true self retreats deeper into hiding. Jung understood that such splits inevitably create psychological symptoms, as the unlived aspects of the personality seek expression through indirect means. The highly sensitive person may experience anxiety, depression, physical symptoms, or relationship difficulties as their authentic nature struggles to find expression despite the shadow's attempts to suppress it. The fear of being too much becomes particularly acute in intimate relationships. The highly sensitive person may find themselves constantly monitoring their emotional expressions, checking to see if they are being too intense, too needy, too overwhelming for their partners, friends, or family members. They may withdraw preemptively to avoid the risk of rejection, or conversely, they may become hypervigilant about others' responses, interpreting every subtle shift in mood or energy as evidence that they have once again revealed too much of their true nature. This hypervigilance creates a painful irony. The very sensitivity that could allow for deep, meaningful connections becomes a source of anxiety and disconnection. The highly sensitive person's natural ability to read emotional subtleties becomes distorted by the shadow's interpretations, turning their gift for empathy into a weapon of self-torture. They read withdrawal in moments of ordinary preoccupation, rejection in moments of natural separateness, disapproval in moments of simple distraction. The shadow also manifests in the highly sensitive person's relationship with their own needs. Having been taught that their natural requirements for quiet space and processing time are excessive or unrealistic, they often develop a deep ambivalence about asking for what they need. They may become experts at accommodating others while neglecting themselves, creating elaborate justifications for why they should be able to handle more stimulation, more social interaction, more multitasking than their nervous system can actually process. This self-neglect often masquerades as selflessness or strength, but it is actually a form of violence against their own nature. The highly sensitive person learns to override their internal signals, to push through overwhelm rather than honoring it, to say yes when their body and psyche are screaming no. They develop what we might call a tolerance for self-betrayal, becoming accomplished at abandoning themselves in service of what they believe others expect from them. The consequences of this pattern extend far beyond momentary discomfort. Chronic overwhelm and self-override can lead to a cascade of physical and psychological symptoms. The nervous system, pushed beyond its capacity for too long, may begin to break down in various ways. anxiety disorders, depression, chronic fatigue, autoimmune conditions, and a host of other health issues often plague highly sensitive people who have not learned to honor their natural rhythms and limitations. But perhaps the most tragic consequence of the overwhelmed shadow is the way it obscures the highly sensitive person's awareness of their own gifts. When they are caught in cycles of self-condemnation and overstimulation, they cannot access the profound capacities that their sensitivity offers. Their depth of feeling becomes a source of suffering rather than wisdom. Their empathic abilities become a burden rather than a healing gift. Their capacity for subtlety and nuance becomes lost in the noise of overwhelm and self-criticism. This is where Jung's understanding of the shadow becomes particularly relevant and hopeful, for Jung recognized that the shadow contains not only our feared and rejected aspects, but also our unrealized potential. The very qualities that we have learned to despise about ourselves often hold the keys to our greatest contributions and deepest fulfillment. The shadow is not just what we must overcome, but what we must reclaim and integrate consciously. For the highly sensitive person, this means recognizing that their capacity for overwhelm is intimately connected to their capacity for depth. The same nervous system that becomes easily overstimulated is also capable of profound subtlety and awareness. The same emotional apparatus that feels too much is also capable of extraordinary empathy and healing presence. The very intensity that feels like a curse contains within it the seeds of profound gifts. The alchemical process of transforming the shadow begins with what Jung called recognition, the conscious acknowledgement of what has been unconscious. The highly sensitive person must begin to see their patterns of self-condemnation and overwhelm not as evidence of their inadequacy, but as symptoms of a profound misunderstanding about their nature. They must recognize that they have been trying to live according to rules that were never designed for their particular constitution. This recognition often comes as a shock, followed by grief. There is mourning to be done for all the years of self-rejection, for all the times they abandoned their own needs, for all the potential that was suppressed in service of trying to be someone they were never meant to be. This grief is necessary and healing, creating space for a new relationship with their sensitivity to emerge. But recognition and grief are only the beginning of the shadow work. The real transformation happens through what Jung called active imagination, the conscious engagement with the rejected aspects of the psyche. For the highly sensitive person, this means developing a relationship with their overwhelm that is curious rather than condemnatory, compassionate rather than critical. When overwhelm arises, instead of immediately judging it as weakness or failure, the conscious, highly sensitive person can begin to ask different questions. What is my nervous system trying to tell me? What boundary needs to be set? What kind of support or environment does my system need right now? How can I honor this signal, rather than overriding it? This shift from judgment to curiosity begins to transform the very experience of overwhelm. Instead of being an enemy to be fought or a weakness to be hidden, overwhelm becomes a teacher, a messenger from the deep wisdom of the body and psyche. It begins to reveal patterns about environments, relationships, and activities that are supportive versus those that are depleting. It becomes a guidance system for navigating life in a way that honors rather than violates the sensitive constitution. As this relationship with overwhelm transforms, something remarkable begins to happen. The highly sensitive person starts to discover that their sensitivity, when properly supported and honored, is not a source of weakness but of extraordinary strength. They begin to recognize that their depth of processing allows them to see patterns and connections that others miss. Their emotional intensity, when not suppressed or judged, becomes a powerful tool for healing and transformation, both their own and others. The shadow work also reveals the profound service that the highly sensitive person has been providing, often unconsciously. Their tendency to become overwhelmed in toxic environments makes them natural detectors of what is unhealthy or unbalanced. Their emotional reactivity to dishonesty, superficiality, or cruelty serves as an early warning system for themselves and others. Their need for authenticity and depth creates pressure for more genuine, meaningful ways of being in relationship and community. When the highly sensitive person begins to understand their overwhelm as information rather than pathology, they can start to use it as a compass for creating a life that truly supports their nature. They can begin to make choices about environments, relationships, work, and lifestyle based on how these elements affect their nervous system rather than on external expectations or judgments. This process often requires what Jung called a revaluation of values, a conscious examination of the beliefs and assumptions that have been governing their life. The highly sensitive person must question the cultural messages that define strength as the ability to endure overwhelm rather than the wisdom to avoid it. They must challenge the notion that sensitivity equals weakness and begin to recognize it as a form of sophisticated intelligence. This revaluation is not merely intellectual but deeply embodied. It requires learning to feel the difference between environments and relationships that support their sensitivity versus those that assault it. It means developing what we might call somatic wisdom, the ability to read the subtle signals of their nervous system and respond accordingly. As this wisdom develops, the highly sensitive person often discovers that they can handle much more intensity and stimulation than they previously thought possible, but only when they are properly resourced, supported, and honoring their natural rhythms. When they are well rested, emotionally nourished, and in environments that respect their needs, they can engage with the world from a place of strength rather than depletion. This transformation of relationship with overwhelm creates a ripple effect throughout all areas of life. Relationships become more authentic and satisfying, as the highly sensitive person learns to communicate their needs clearly and set appropriate boundaries. Work becomes more fulfilling as they seek or create roles that utilize their gifts rather than assault their limitations. Creativity flourishes as the emotional intensity that was once overwhelming becomes fuel for artistic and innovative expression. Perhaps most significantly, the integration of the overwhelmed shadow allows the highly sensitive person to step into their role as healers and wisdom keepers more consciously. When they are no longer depleted by unconscious overwhelm and self-judgment, they have energy available for the profound service that their sensitivity naturally offers. They become able to hold space for others' intense emotions, to offer the depth of presence that their friends and family crave, to contribute their unique perspectives and insights to their communities and the world. The shadow work also reveals that the highly sensitive person's struggles with overwhelm are not merely personal but archetypal. They are carrying and processing emotional material, not just for themselves but for the collective. Their overwhelm often reflects the overwhelm of the culture itself, the pace of modern life, the assault of constant stimulation, the emotional toxicity of environments that prioritize productivity over humanity. In this context, the highly sensitive person's overwhelm becomes a form of canary in the coal mine service, alerting us all to the ways our culture has become hostile to human sensitivity and depth. Their healing journey becomes not just personal transformation, but a contribution to the healing of the collective shadow, the ways we have all learned to override our natural rhythms and needs in service of external demands. This recognition brings with it both burden and blessing. The burden is the responsibility of conscious participation in this collective healing. The blessing is the knowledge that their sensitivity serves a purpose far greater than their individual experience, that their healing contributes to the healing of the world itself. As the highly sensitive person emerges from the no grido of the overwhelmed shadow, they carry with them not just personal healing but wisdom that can benefit all of humanity. They have learned firsthand the cost of ignoring our natural rhythms and needs. They have discovered the profound healing that comes from honoring sensitivity rather than condemning it. They have transformed their greatest apparent weakness into their most powerful gift. But this emergence from the shadow is not a one-time event, but an ongoing process. The patterns of overwhelm and self-judgment can resurface, especially during times of stress or transition. The work of conscious sensitivity requires ongoing vigilance and self-compassion. It is a lifelong practice of choosing again and again to honor rather than override their natural responses, to see overwhelm as information rather than failure, to treat their sensitivity as a gift to be cultivated rather than a problem to be solved. The reward for this ongoing work is a life of profound authenticity and service. The highly sensitive person who has integrated their overwhelmed shadow becomes a beacon of possibility for others, proof that sensitivity and strength are not opposites, but intimate partners, that depth and resilience can coexist, that it is possible to be both tender and powerful in a world that often demands we choose between them. In learning to transform their relationship with overwhelm, the highly sensitive person discovers one of the most important truths of their nature, that their sensitivity is not something they must survive, but something they are meant to thrive with. The very intensity that once felt like too much becomes the foundation for a life of extraordinary depth, meaning, and contribution. The shadow transforms into light, not by being eliminated, but by being understood, honored, and consciously integrated into the fullness of who they are meant to be. In the ancient tarot, the hermit stands alone on a mountain peak, lantern raised high against the darkness, a figure of profound solitude that paradoxically illuminates the path for others. This archetypal image speaks to one of the most misunderstood aspects of the highly sensitive person's nature, their deep instinctual need for solitude. In a culture that equates sociability with health and introversion with dysfunction, the sensitive soul's requirement for sacred aloneness becomes another source of shame and misunderstanding. Yet Jung recognized that this turning inward is not retreat from life, but movement toward the very essence of life itself, a pilgrimage to the inner sanctum where the self dwells and wisdom is born. The highly sensitive person's need for solitude emerges from the very depths of their being, as natural and necessary as breathing, where others may experience alone, time as emptiness to be filled or boredom to be escaped. The sensitive soul finds in solitude a return to wholeness, a restoration of the psychic energy that has been scattered through countless interactions with a world that does not understand their nature. Solitude is not absence but presence, presence to themselves, to their inner processes, to the subtle movements of consciousness that can only be perceived in the stillness that comes when external demands are removed. This need for solitude often manifests early in the sensitive child's life, though it is frequently misinterpreted by well-meaning adults who worry about their antisocial tendencies or their apparent inability to enjoy the same activities that bring joy to other children. The sensitive child who prefers reading in their room to playground activities, who finds birthday parties overwhelming rather than exciting, who needs quiet time to process the day's experiences, is not displaying symptoms of depression or social anxiety. They are responding to an inner wisdom that recognizes the necessity of internal space for their psychological well-being. Yet, in a culture that privileges extroversion and group activities, this natural inclination towards solitude becomes pathologized. The sensitive child learns that their need for alone time is evidence of their social inadequacy, their inability to connect with others, their fundamental unlikability. They begin to force themselves into social situations that drain and overwhelm them, believing that this is the price of being normal and acceptable. The gift of their natural introversion becomes buried under layers of social conditioning and self-doubt. Jung understood that introversion is not a lesser form of extroversion, but an entirely different orientation of consciousness. Where the extrovert's energy flows outward toward the external world of people and activities, the introvert's energy flows inward toward the internal world of reflection and contemplation. Neither orientation is superior. They are simply different ways of engaging with existence, each offering its own gifts and requiring its own forms of nourishment. For the highly sensitive person who is often naturally introverted, or what Jung would call inwardly directed, solitude becomes the laboratory where experience is processed, integrated, and transformed into wisdom. The overwhelming stimulation of daily life, the conversations, the sensory input, the emotional atmospheres of various environments requires time and space to be digested properly. Without this processing time, the sensitive person becomes like a computer with too many programs running simultaneously, eventually crashing under the weight of unintegrated experience. But solitude for the highly sensitive person is not merely passive retreat. It is active engagement with the inner world. In the silence and stillness of their hermit's cave, profound psychological work takes place. Emotions that could not be fully felt in the moment are finally given space to be experienced and released. Insights that were gestating beneath the surface of consciousness are allowed to emerge into awareness. Creative ideas that were crowded out by external demands find room to breathe and develop. This inner work follows patterns that Jung recognized in his studies of alchemy and individuation. The highly sensitive person's solitude often begins with what the alchemists called the solutio, a dissolving of the rigid structures of the ego mind that allows for a more fluid relationship with the unconscious. In the safety of their hermit's sanctum, the sensitive soul can allow their carefully constructed social personas to relax, revealing the more authentic aspects of their nature that may have been hidden or suppressed in social interactions. This dissolution can initially feel disorienting or even frightening. Without the external structure of social roles and expectations, the highly sensitive person may experience a temporary loss of identity, a sense of not knowing who they are when they are not performing for others. This is what Jung called the night sea journey, a necessary descent into the unconscious waters where the ego's false certainties are stripped away to make room for a more authentic relationship with the self. In this liminal space of solitude, the highly sensitive person often encounters what Jung termed the transcendent function, the bridge between conscious and unconscious that allows for genuine psychological integration. Dreams become more vivid and meaningful, synchronicities multiply, creative inspirations flow more freely. The sensitive person begins to experience their solitude not as loneliness, but as communion with the deeper layers of their own psyche, and through that, with the archetypal realm that connects all human experience. This communion reveals one of the most profound aspects of the sensitive person's solitude. It is not truly separate from relationship, but is actually preparation for deeper, more authentic connection with others. The highly sensitive person who has learned to be genuinely alone with themselves brings a quality of presence to their relationships that is rare and precious. Having faced their own depths in solitude, they are less likely to project their unconscious material onto others or to use relationships as escape from their own inner work. The hermit's lantern in the tarot image represents this transformed quality of presence. The light that the hermit carries is not harsh or demanding, but gentle and illuminating, the kind of consciousness that can see clearly without judgment, that can hold space for complexity and contradiction, that can offer guidance without imposing its will. This is the gift that the highly sensitive person develops through their commitment to sacred solitude, the capacity to be a healing presence in the world precisely because they have learned to be healing presence for themselves. But this transformation of solitude from isolation to integration requires conscious cultivation. Many highly sensitive people experience their alone time as a refuge from an overwhelming world, but they may not yet know how to use that time for genuine psychological and spiritual development. They may fill their solitude with distractions, television, social media, busy work, that provide temporary relief from overstimulation, but do not offer the deeper nourishment that their psyche craves. True solitude requires what Jung called active imagination, the conscious engagement with the spontaneous products of the unconscious. This might take the form of journaling, artistic creation, meditation, dream work, or simply mindful attention to the movements of thought and feeling that arise in stillness. The key is learning to be present to their inner experience, without trying to control or direct it, allowing the natural wisdom of their psyche to reveal itself gradually. For many highly sensitive people, This kind of engaged solitude reveals a rich inner landscape that they may never have fully explored. They discover that their sensitivity extends not only to external stimuli, but to subtle movements within their own consciousness. They become aware of thoughts and feelings that arise and pass away like clouds across the sky of awareness. They begin to sense the deeper currents of meaning and purpose that flow beneath the surface of their daily concerns. This internal exploration often leads to what Jung called the discovery of the self, that organizing principle within the psyche that transcends the ego and connects the individual to the larger patterns of meaning in existence. For the highly sensitive person, this connection to the self often feels more immediate and accessible than it does for others, perhaps because their natural sensitivity makes them more attuned to subtle psychological processes. The relationship with the self that develops in solitude becomes a source of profound strength and guidance for the highly sensitive person. When they are connected to this deeper center within themselves, they are less dependent on external validation and approval. They can navigate social situations from a place of inner security rather than reactive anxiety. They can set boundaries that honor their nature without feeling guilty or apologetic about their needs. This inner security also transforms the quality of their relationships with others. The highly sensitive person who has cultivated a genuine relationship with their own depths brings to their connections with others a quality of authentic presence that is deeply nourishing. They are less likely to lose themselves in others' emotions or to become overwhelmed by the responsibility of managing others' feelings. Having learned to hold space for their own complexity, they can hold space for others' complexity as well. The hermit's journey also reveals the highly sensitive person's natural affinity for what Jung called the religious function of the psyche, the innate human drive toward meaning, transcendence, and connection with something greater than the individual ego. In the stillness of their solitude, many highly sensitive people discover a natural mystical inclination, a capacity for direct spiritual experience that does not necessarily require traditional religious frameworks. This spiritual dimension of solitude often manifests as a sense of profound interconnectedness with all life, despite, or perhaps because of, the physical aloneness. The highly sensitive person in deep solitude may experience what the mystics have called the unity consciousness, a direct knowing that their individual awareness is part of a larger fabric of consciousness that includes all beings. This experience can be both blissful and overwhelming, requiring careful integration to avoid inflation or spiritual bypassing. The challenge for many highly sensitive people lies not in accessing these depths, but in learning to integrate them with their daily lives. The hermit must eventually come down from the mountain and share the light of their lantern with others. This transition from solitude to engagement can be one of the most difficult aspects of the sensitive person's journey, requiring them to maintain their connection to their inner depths while navigating the demands and distractions of social existence. This integration process often reveals another layer of the hermit archetype, the hermit as teacher and guide. The highly sensitive person who has genuinely cultivated their solitude often finds that others are naturally drawn to them for guidance, support, and healing presence. They become unconscious therapists, spiritual directors, and wisdom keepers in their communities, offering to others the deep listening and authentic presence that they have learned to give themselves. But this role of guide and teacher requires careful boundaries and conscious development. The highly sensitive person can easily become overwhelmed by others' needs if they have not learned to maintain their connection to their own center. They may find themselves depleted by constant demands for their healing presence, or they may become inflated by their ability to help others, losing touch with their own humanity and vulnerability. The ongoing challenge of the hermit's path is learning to move fluidly between solitude and engagement, inner work and outer service, receiving and giving. This requires what Jung called the transcendent function, the capacity to hold the tension between opposites until a new synthesis emerges. For the highly sensitive person, this means learning to be both deeply solitary and genuinely relational, both inwardly focused and outwardly engaged. This synthesis often manifests as a natural rhythm that honors both the need for withdrawal and the call to service. The wise hermit learns to read the signals of their own energy and attention, withdrawing for restoration when needed and emerging to offer their gifts when they are genuinely resourced. They develop what we might call sustainable service, a way of engaging with others that nourishes rather than depletes their essential nature. The hermit's lantern also represents the consciousness that emerges from this conscious cultivation of solitude, a quality of awareness that can illuminate the path for others without imposing direction or judgment. The highly sensitive person who has integrated their need for solitude develops an extraordinary capacity for holding space, for being present to others' experiences without trying to fix or change them. This holding presence is one of the most precious gifts that the highly sensitive hermit offers to the world. In a culture of quick fixes and surface solutions, they provide depth and patience. In a world of noise and distraction, they offer stillness and attention. In a society that fears authentic emotion and genuine vulnerability, they create safe spaces for real human experience to be shared and honored. The development of this gift requires ongoing commitment to the inner work that solitude makes possible. The highly sensitive person must continue to tend their inner fire, to maintain their connection to the depths of their own experience, to honor their need for withdrawal and restoration. This is not selfishness, but service. For only through their own wholeness can they offer genuine healing presence to others. As the hermit archetype fully emerges, in the highly sensitive person's consciousness, they often discover that their apparent weakness, their need for alone time, has been transformed into their greatest strength. Their capacity for solitude becomes a source of wisdom, creativity, and healing presence that serves not only their own development, but the healing of their communities and the world. The hermit's path is not for everyone, but for the highly sensitive person. It is often an essential aspect of their individuation journey. Through the conscious cultivation of sacred solitude, they learn to honor their nature rather than apologize for it, to find strength in their depths rather than shame in their sensitivity, to offer their gifts from a place of fullness rather than depletion. In a world that desperately needs the wisdom that emerges from depth and contemplation, the highly sensitive hermit serves an essential function. They are the keepers of inner space, the guardians of silence, the protectors of the contemplative dimension of human experience. Their lantern illuminates not only their own path, but the way forward for all who seek authentic connection with the depths of existence. The hermit's sanctum is not a place of escape, but of preparation for a life of conscious service that honors both solitude and relationship, both inner work and outer engagement. In learning to be genuinely alone, the highly sensitive person discovers how to be genuinely present with others. In cultivating their inner depths, they develop the capacity to meet others in their depths as well. The hermit's journey transforms isolation into integration, loneliness into wholeness, withdrawal into wisdom that illuminates the path for all. In the ancient temples of Delphi and Dodona, the oracles served as conduits between the mortal and divine realms, channeling wisdom and prophecy through their own bodies and consciousness. These sacred figures paid a profound price for their gifts. They became vessels for forces greater than themselves, often losing their individual identity in service of collective needs. The highly sensitive person embodies this same archetypal pattern in contemporary form, serving as unconscious oracles who channel and process the emotional states of others, absorbing the psychic atmosphere of their environments with an intensity that can be both blessing and burden. Jung understood that certain individuals possess what he called thin boundaries between themselves and others, a permeability of consciousness that allows them to sense and absorb emotional information that remains invisible to those with more rigid psychological defenses. This capacity for emotional contagion is not weakness or pathology, but a sophisticated form of psychic sensitivity that connects the individual to the deeper currents of the collective unconscious. Like the ancient oracles, the highly sensitive person becomes a living barometer for the emotional climate of their surroundings, registering subtle shifts in mood, energy, and psychological atmosphere with remarkable accuracy. But this gift comes with challenges that the highly sensitive person must learn to navigate consciously. Without proper understanding and boundaries, emotional contagion can become overwhelming, leaving the sensitive individual confused about which emotions belong to them and which they have absorbed from others. They may find themselves inexplicably sad after visiting certain places, anxious around particular people, or emotionally drained after social interactions, not understanding that they have been unconsciously processing emotional material that doesn't originate within their own psyche. The phenomenon of emotional contagion operates through what Jung called participation mystique, that primitive psychological state where the boundary between self and other becomes fluid and permeable. While most adults develop increasingly solid ego boundaries as they mature, the highly sensitive person retains something of this original permeability, allowing them to merge momentarily with the emotional atmosphere around them. This capacity enables them to understand others with extraordinary depth and accuracy, but it also makes them vulnerable to being overwhelmed by emotions that are not their own. This vulnerability manifests in countless ways throughout the highly sensitive person's daily experience. They walk into a room and immediately sense tension between two people who appear to be having a pleasant conversation. They feel inexplicably depressed after spending time with someone who is struggling with hidden grief. They become anxious in crowded spaces not because of claustrophobia, but because they are absorbing the collective anxiety of the crowd. Their emotional state becomes a reflection of their environment rather than their internal experience. For many highly sensitive people, this phenomenon remains unconscious for years or decades. They experience the emotional absorption, but don't understand its source, leading them to believe that they are simply moody, unstable, or mentally ill. They may seek therapy for depression or anxiety without realizing that their symptoms are often environmental rather than personal. They develop elaborate coping strategies to manage their emotional volatility without understanding that they are trying to manage emotions that don't actually belong to them. The unconscious oracle often becomes the designated emotional processor for their family system, workplace, or community. Without realizing it, they absorb and carry the unexpressed feelings of those around them, the family's unspoken grief, the workplace's collective stress, the community's shared trauma. Like emotional sponges, they soak up whatever cannot be acknowledged or processed by others, becoming repositories for the shadow material of their environment. This unconscious service comes at a tremendous cost. The highly sensitive person who chronically absorbs others' emotions may experience symptoms that seem to have no clear cause: sudden mood swings, unexplained physical symptoms, chronic fatigue, or relationship difficulties. They may find themselves drawn to fix or heal others compulsively, not understanding that this urge often stems from their absorption of others' pain rather than from genuine calling or choice. The family dynamics that often surround the highly sensitive child reveal this pattern clearly. The sensitive child frequently becomes the emotional barometer for the family system, reflecting back the unspoken tensions, griefs, and anxieties that the adults cannot or will not address directly. They may develop behavioral problems, academic difficulties, or health issues that mirror the family's emotional dysfunction, serving as the identified patient who carries the symptoms for the entire system. Parents often describe their highly sensitive children as being affected by everything, not realizing that the child is responding to emotional undercurrents that the adults themselves may not be consciously aware of. The child who becomes distressed when their parents argue, even when the argument happens in another room and is conducted in whispers, is demonstrating the oracle's capacity to sense emotional disturbance, regardless of its obvious manifestation. This pattern continues into adulthood as the highly sensitive person gravitates toward relationships and environments where their unconscious processing abilities are needed and utilized. They may find themselves repeatedly attracted to partners who are emotionally unavailable or struggling with unresolved trauma, not because they consciously choose dysfunction, but because their oracle nature responds to the call for emotional healing and processing. In workplace environments, the highly sensitive person often becomes the unofficial therapist, the one colleagues turn to for emotional support and understanding. They may find themselves listening to others' problems for hours, offering comfort and insight, while their own emotional needs remain unmet and unrecognized. Their empathic abilities make them natural counselors and healers, but without conscious boundaries, this service becomes depleting rather than fulfilling. The phenomenon of emotional contagion also extends beyond individual relationships into the collective realm. The highly sensitive person often serves as an early warning system for cultural and social disturbances, feeling the emotional tremors of collective trauma, social upheaval, or environmental destruction before these issues become consciously recognized by the broader population. They may experience seemingly inexplicable anxiety during times of social tension, depression during periods of collective grief, or agitation when ecological systems are under stress. This capacity to feel the pulse of the collective unconscious can be overwhelming and disorienting when it remains unconscious. The highly sensitive person may find themselves affected by news events, natural disasters, or social conflicts in ways that seem disproportionate to their personal involvement. They absorb the emotional impact of collective trauma even when they are geographically or socially distant from the events themselves. Jung's concept of the collective unconscious helps explain this phenomenon. He proposed that beneath the personal unconscious lies a deeper layer of psychic material that is shared by all humanity, a collective repository of archetypal patterns, universal experiences, and inherited emotional responses. The highly sensitive person, with their thin psychological boundaries, has greater access to this collective layer, making them more susceptible to being affected by disturbances in the collective emotional field. But this susceptibility also grants them extraordinary insight into the deeper patterns and movements of human experience. The oracle's burden is also the oracle's gift, the capacity to perceive and understand emotional truths that remain hidden to others. When conscious and properly channeled, this ability becomes a powerful tool for healing and transformation, both personal and collective. The transformation from unconscious absorption to conscious oracular service requires developing what Jung called differentiation, the ability to distinguish between one's own emotional experience and that which belongs to others. This is perhaps one of the most crucial skills the highly sensitive person must develop, yet it is also one of the most challenging because it requires them to swim against the current of their natural permeability. The process begins with awareness, learning to recognize when emotional contagion is occurring. The highly sensitive person must become a detective of their own emotional experience, asking questions like, did this feeling arise from something in my own life? Or did it begin after I encountered a particular person or environment? Does this emotion feel familiar and personal, or foreign and imposed? When did this mood shift occur, and what external circumstances coincided with the change? This investigation requires developing what we might call emotional hygiene, practices that help cleanse the psyche of absorbed material that doesn't belong. Just as physical hygiene removes external dirt and contamination, emotional hygiene clears away the psychic residue that accumulates through contact with others' emotional states. This might involve visualization exercises, energy clearing practices, time in nature, creative expression, or ritual cleansing that helps restore the natural boundaries of the self. But differentiation is not about building walls or shutting down the empathic capacity. The goal is not to stop feeling others' emotions, but to feel them consciously and with choice. The conscious oracle learns to open and close their empathic awareness intentionally, choosing when to receive emotional information and when to maintain protective boundaries. They develop what we might call permeable but not porous boundaries, membranes that can allow information to pass through while maintaining the integrity of their own emotional core. This conscious development of the oracular gift often reveals its profound purpose and value. When the highly sensitive person can distinguish between their own emotions and those they absorb from others, they become capable of extraordinary emotional intelligence and healing presence. They can sense others' unspoken needs, provide comfort for hidden pain, and offer insight into emotional patterns that remain unconscious to those who are experiencing them. The conscious oracle also learns to use their emotional absorption as information rather than simply experiencing it as overwhelm. When they feel sudden anxiety, they can ask whether this might be picking up someone else's stress and use that information to offer appropriate support or to remove themselves from a toxic environment. When they experience unexpected sadness, they can explore whether this might be absorbing unexpressed grief from someone in their vicinity and respond accordingly. This transformation of emotional contagion from burden to gift often reveals the highly sensitive person's natural calling as a healer, counselor, or guide. Their capacity to feel deeply into others' emotional experience makes them extraordinarily effective therapists, coaches, teachers, or spiritual directors. They can meet others in their emotional depths because they have learned to navigate those depths themselves. But the conscious oracle must also learn to manage the energy drain that comes with processing others' emotions. This requires developing what we might call sustainable empathy, the ability to be deeply present to others' emotional experience without becoming depleted or overwhelmed. This often involves learning to process and release absorbed emotions quickly rather than carrying them indefinitely. Many highly sensitive oracles find that they need specific practices for emotional clearing and restoration. Some find relief through movement and exercise, which helps metabolize emotional energy. Others use creative expression, art, music, or writing to transform absorbed emotions into something meaningful and beautiful. Still others find restoration through connection with nature, meditation, or spiritual practice that helps them remember their essential identity beyond the emotions they carry. The oracle's path also requires learning to set boundaries around their empathic service. The conscious oracle learns to say no to requests for emotional support when they are already depleted, to limit their exposure to emotionally toxic environments, and to choose relationships that nourish rather than drain their empathic capacity. This is not selfishness, but wisdom, the recognition that their gift can only be sustained when it is properly managed and protected. Perhaps most importantly, the conscious oracle learns to receive as well as give emotional support. Many highly sensitive people become so accustomed to being the one who provides emotional care that they forget how to receive it. Learning to be vulnerable, to ask for help, to allow others to witness and hold their own emotional experience becomes an essential part of maintaining balance and preventing burnout. The oracle's burden also carries profound spiritual implications. Many highly sensitive people discover that their emotional absorption connects them to something larger than individual psychology, to the suffering and healing of the world itself. They begin to understand their sensitivity as a form of spiritual service, a participation in the collective work of processing and transforming human emotional material. This recognition can bring both meaning and responsibility. The conscious oracle may feel called to dedicate their life to healing work, to environmental activism, to social justice, or to other forms of service that address the collective emotional wounds they feel so acutely. They may become advocates for the voiceless, healers for the traumatized, or guides for those lost in emotional confusion. But this calling must be balanced with self-care and realistic limitations. The oracle who tries to heal the entire world often burns out quickly, becoming overwhelmed by the magnitude of suffering they perceive. Learning to focus their healing gifts appropriately, to work within their capacity, and to trust that others share in the collective work of healing becomes essential for long-term sustainability. The oracle's journey also reveals the interconnected nature of all emotional experience. Through their direct felt sense of others' emotions, highly sensitive people often develop a profound understanding of the unity underlying apparent separation. They feel viscerally that we are all connected at emotional and energetic levels, that individual suffering affects the whole, and that individual healing contributes to collective healing. This understanding often transforms the oracle's relationship with their own emotional experience. They begin to see their personal healing, not just as individual development, but as contribution to the healing of the collective emotional field. Their work on their own trauma, grief, and emotional patterns becomes a form of service to the whole of humanity. As the oracle archetype fully emerges in consciousness, the highly sensitive person often discovers that their greatest apparent weakness, their emotional permeability, has become their greatest strength. Their capacity to feel others' emotions deeply becomes a powerful tool for healing, insight, and transformation. They learn to channel their sensitivity consciously, using their oracular gifts in service of both individual and collective healing. The oracle's burden thus transforms into the oracle's blessing, not through eliminating the emotional absorption, but through learning to work with it consciously and sustainably. The highly sensitive person who integrates their oracular nature becomes a bridge between the conscious and unconscious realms, a translator of emotional truth, a healer of hidden wounds. They serve the ancient function of the oracle while finding ways to thrive rather than merely survive in their sacred and demanding role. In the hidden chambers of the human heart, where silence speaks louder than words and feeling flows deeper than thought, there exists a tender wound that never fully heals, the place where the inner child dwells, holding within its small hands all the tears that have ever been shed for the world's sorrows. This is not merely personal pain, though it encompasses every scraped knee of childhood, every harsh word that cut too deep, every moment when love felt absent or conditional. No, this is something far more profound, far more sacred. It is the repository of collective human suffering, the place where the highly sensitive soul becomes a vessel for the tears of all beings. The inner child of the sensitive person does not weep only for itself. It weeps for the sparrow that fell from the nest, for the homeless man shivering in the doorway, for the mother struggling to feed her children, for the earth itself as forests burn and oceans rise. This is the great mystery of sensitivity, that the boundaries between self and world become so permeable that one's own tears become indistinguishable from the tears of existence itself. Jung understood this phenomenon deeply when he spoke of the wounded healer archetype, recognizing that those who feel most acutely are often called to serve as conduits for collective healing. To understand the inner child's tears, we must first descend into the depths where this eternal child resides. It is not the literal child we once were, though it carries those memories. Rather, it is the part of the psyche that remains forever open, forever vulnerable, forever capable of being touched by beauty and wounded by cruelty with equal intensity. This child does not grow older. It does not develop the protective calluses that shield the adult heart from feeling too much. It remains perpetually skinless, as it were, every nerve ending exposed to the winds of experience. The highly sensitive person learns early that their emotional responses are different, more intense, more enduring than those around them. A harsh word lingers for days, not hours. A beautiful sunset moves them to tears, while others barely notice. A friend's disappointment becomes their own heartbreak. This is not weakness, though it may appear so to a world that values emotional restraint and quick recovery. This is the functioning of a nervous system tuned to frequencies that most cannot hear, a heart calibrated to resonances that escape ordinary perception. The inner child's tears flow from this extraordinary capacity to feel, but they also serve a function that transcends personal experience. In the alchemical tradition, tears were considered a powerful transformative agent, capable of dissolving the hardest substances and revealing the gold hidden within base materials. The tears of the sensitive soul work in much the same way. They dissolve the barriers between conscious and unconscious, between self and other, between personal wound and universal suffering. Through these tears, the individual psyche opens to depths that would otherwise remain sealed and inaccessible. Consider how the inner child processes pain differently from the adult ego. The ego seeks to categorize, explain, and ultimately dismiss emotional pain as quickly as possible. It constructs narratives that make sense of suffering, assigns blame, finds solutions, moves on. But the inner child does not move on. It remains present with the pain, holding it tenderly, allowing it to flow through the body and soul without resistance. This is not masochism or self-indulgence. It is a profound form of emotional intelligence that recognizes pain as carrying important information about the state of one's inner and outer world. The sensitive person's inner child often carries what seems like a disproportionate amount of early wounds. These may be obvious traumas, abuse, neglect, abandonment, or they may be the subtler injuries that come from being fundamentally misunderstood. The child who cried too easily, who needed more reassurance, who couldn't handle loud noises or chaotic environments, who withdrew into books or fantasy when reality felt too harsh. This child learned early that their very nature was somehow problematic, that their sensitivity was a flaw to be corrected rather than a gift to be honored. These early experiences create what Jung called complexes, autonomous clusters of psychic energy that operate somewhat independently of conscious control. The sensitive person may develop a wounded child complex that colors all subsequent experiences with expectations of misunderstanding, rejection, or emotional invalidation. This complex can become a source of great suffering as it filters new experiences through the lens of old wounds, finding confirmation of unworthiness or inadequacy even in neutral situations. Yet within this very complex lies the seed of profound transformation. The wounded child complex, when approached with consciousness and compassion, reveals itself to be not merely a source of personal pain, but a doorway to universal understanding. The one who has known deep wounding develops an extraordinary capacity for empathy, an ability to recognize and respond to suffering wherever it appears. This is the emergence of the wounded healer archetype, the one whose own wounds become the source of their ability to heal others. The process of healing the inner child is not about eliminating pain or developing a thicker skin. Such approaches, while perhaps offering temporary relief, ultimately cut the sensitive person off from their greatest gifts. Instead, the healing involves learning to hold pain differently, to create a conscious relationship with emotional intensity that honors both its difficulty and its wisdom. This requires what Jung called holding the tension of the opposites, remaining open to feeling while developing the inner strength to bear that feeling without being overwhelmed by it. The inner child's tears often carry messages that the adult mind would prefer to ignore. They speak of unmet needs for safety, understanding, and authentic connection. They reveal the ways in which the sensitive soul has contorted itself to fit into spaces that were never designed to accommodate its true nature. They express the grief of having learned to hide one's light, to mute one's voice, to apologize for taking up space in a world that can feel hostile to sensitivity. But these tears also carry prophecies of what is possible when sensitivity is fully embraced and integrated. They water the seeds of compassion that lie dormant in the heart. They soften the hardened places where cynicism has taken root. They create the fertile ground in which wisdom can grow. The sensitive person who learns to honor their inner child's tears, rather than rushing to stop them or feeling ashamed of them, discovers that these tears are not a sign of brokenness, but of profound wholeness, the wholeness that comes from remaining connected to the full spectrum of human feeling. The collective dimension of the inner child's tears cannot be overlooked. Jung recognized that individual psychology is always embedded within the larger patterns of the collective unconscious, and nowhere is this more evident than in the emotional life of the highly sensitive person. Their tears often seem to exceed what the situation warrants because they are tapping into something much larger than the immediate circumstance. They are feeling into the grief of the collective, the sorrow of a world that has lost touch with its own sensitivity, its own capacity for deep feeling and genuine connection. This is why the sensitive person often feels like they are carrying too much, why their emotional responses can feel overwhelming even to themselves. They are not just processing their own pain, but serving as a kind of psychic receptor for the unprocessed grief of the collective. This can feel like a terrible burden, and indeed it can become pathological if not understood and integrated consciously. But it can also be understood as a sacred calling to serve as an emotional witness, a feeler of feelings that the collective has numbed itself to. The mythological figure of the weeping goddess appears in cultures around the world: Isis mourning Osiris, the Virgin Mary at the foot of the cross, Kuan Yin weeping for the suffering of all beings. These figures represent the sacred function of tears, the way in which deep feeling serves not just the individual but the larger community. The highly sensitive person often finds themselves in this archetypal role, feeling on behalf of those who have forgotten how to feel, weeping tears that water the parched earth of collective consciousness. Yet the inner child's tears are not always sorrowful. They flow equally in response to beauty, to love, to moments of transcendence that pierce the veil of ordinary consciousness. The sensitive person may weep at a piece of music that captures something ineffable about the human experience, at a sunset that speaks of eternity, at an act of unexpected kindness that restores faith in human nature. These tears of beauty and gratitude are as important as the tears of pain, for they reveal the inner child's capacity to be moved by life's sacred dimensions. The challenge for the highly sensitive person is learning to trust these tears, to see them not as evidence of inadequacy, but as proof of their extraordinary capacity for deep feeling. This requires a fundamental shift in how they understand their own nature. Instead of viewing sensitivity as a liability to be overcome, they must learn to see it as a superpower to be cultivated and channeled consciously. This shift often requires grieving the ways in which they learned to suppress or hide their sensitivity. The inner child may need to weep for all the times they were told they were too much, for all the moments they dimmed their light to make others comfortable, for all the authentic responses they swallowed to avoid conflict or rejection. This grief is necessary and healing. It clears the way for a more authentic relationship with one's own emotional nature. The integration of the inner child's tears involves developing what might be called conscious sensitivity, the ability to feel deeply while maintaining awareness of the feeling process itself. This is different from being swept away by emotion. It is more like becoming a skilled surfer who can ride the waves of feeling with grace and purpose. The sensitive person learns to recognize when they are feeling their own emotions versus picking up on others' emotions, when they are responding to present circumstances versus being triggered by past wounds, when their tears are calling for action versus calling for simple witnessing. This conscious relationship with emotional intensity transforms the inner child's tears from a source of overwhelm into a source of wisdom and guidance. The tears become teachers, showing the way toward greater self-understanding and authentic living. They reveal what truly matters, what deserves attention and care, what needs to be protected or nurtured in the inner landscape. The wounded healer archetype fully emerges when the sensitive person learns to transform their own processed pain into a gift for others. Having learned to hold their own tears with tenderness, they develop an extraordinary capacity to hold space for others' tears as well. They become the friend who doesn't rush to fix or minimize pain, but can simply be present with it, offering the rare gift of emotional witnessing without judgment. This is not about becoming a professional healer, though many highly sensitive people are drawn to helping professions. It is about embodying a quality of presence that is itself healing, a way of being in the world that gives others permission to feel deeply, to be authentic, to honor their own inner child's wisdom. The sensitive person who has integrated their capacity for deep feeling becomes a kind of emotional permission giver, modeling what it looks like to be fully alive to the spectrum of human experience. The tears of the inner child also serve an important function in the process of individuation, Jung's term for the psychological development toward wholeness. They wash away the false layers of persona that the sensitive person may have developed to fit in or avoid conflict. They dissolve the defenses that, while perhaps necessary for survival in earlier stages of life, eventually become barriers to authentic self-expression. Through the tears, the sensitive person contacts their true nature beneath the adaptations and compensations. They discover that their sensitivity is not something to be cured or overcome, but something to be honored and skillfully expressed. This discovery often brings its own tears, tears of relief at no longer having to pretend to be someone they're not, tears of grief for the years spent trying to be different, tears of joy at finally coming home to themselves. The inner child's tears also reveal the profound interconnectedness of all life. Because the sensitive person feels so deeply, they begin to understand experientially what mystics and quantum physicists tell us, that all boundaries are ultimately illusion, that what affects one affects all. Their tears become a direct experience of what Buddhist philosophy calls interdependence, the recognition that no being exists in isolation, that joy and suffering are shared experiences in the web of existence. This understanding brings both greater responsibility and greater freedom. The sensitive person realizes that their emotional responses are not just personal quirks, but important information about the state of the world around them. Their tears may be early warning systems, alerting them to toxicity in relationships or environments that others haven't yet recognized. Their joy may serve as beacons, pointing toward what is truly life-giving and worth pursuing. As the sensitive person learns to honor their inner child's tears, they also learn to set boundaries that protect their emotional well-being without cutting them off from their gifts. They discover that they don't have to absorb every emotion they encounter, that they can feel deeply while maintaining a sense of their own emotional autonomy. This is perhaps one of the most important skills for the highly sensitive person to develop, the ability to be permeable without being invaded, open without being overwhelmed. The tears of the inner child ultimately serve the larger purpose of soul-making, the lifelong process of becoming who we truly are beneath all our conditioning and adaptations. For the sensitive person, this process cannot happen without honoring their capacity for deep feeling, without allowing their tears to do their transformative work. The attempt to shut down emotional intensity only leads to a kind of spiritual death, a cutting off from the very source of their wisdom and gifts. In the end, the inner child's tears are not a problem to be solved, but a mystery to be lived. They are one of the ways the soul speaks to us, one of the ways we stay connected to the profound depths of human experience. The highly sensitive person who learns to trust these tears, to see them as allies rather than enemies, discovers that they lead not to weakness, but to a kind of strength that the world desperately needs. The strength to feel fully, to love deeply, to remain open even in the face of pain. This is the great paradox of sensitivity, that in embracing our capacity to be wounded, we discover our capacity to heal. In honoring our tears, we water the gardens of our own becoming. In feeling deeply, we touch the eternal child within us, that knows, beyond all doubt, that love is real, that beauty matters, that every moment of existence is sacred and worthy of our full presence. The inner child weeps not because the world is too much, but because it is so precious, so fragile, so deserving of tenderness, that any harm done to it breaks the heart. These are the tears of one who sees clearly, who feels truly, who loves without reservation. They are the tears that water the seeds of a more compassionate world, one feeling at a time, one moment of authentic presence at a time, one conscious choice to honor the sacred sensitivity that lives within the human heart. Through these tears, the sensitive person becomes a bridge between worlds, between the practical and the sacred, between the individual and the collective, between what is and what could be. They become living proof that another way is possible, that we don't have to choose between being strong and being tender, between being successful and being authentic, between protecting ourselves and remaining open to love. The inner child's tears are thus revealed to be not a burden but a blessing, not a weakness but a superpower, not something to overcome but something to fully embrace as one of the most profound gifts a human being can possess, the gift of feeling life in all its intensity, beauty, and sacred complexity. In the ancient laboratories of the medieval alchemists, fire was understood not as mere destruction, but as the great transformer, the divine force that could transmute, lead into gold, base matter into precious essence, the crude into the sublime. The alchemists knew that without the purifying flame, without the intense heat that breaks down old structures and forges new ones, no true transformation could occur. They understood fire as both destroyer and creator, both ending and beginning, both death and rebirth made manifest in the dance of flame and substance. For the highly sensitive soul, the overwhelming cascade of sensory input that floods their awareness serves as this very alchemical fire, what appears to others as mere hypersensitivity, as an inconvenient overreaction to stimuli that most can easily ignore or filter out, reveals itself to the conscious observer as nothing less than the raw material of spiritual transformation. The sensitive person does not simply experience more. They are forged in the crucible of experience itself, refined through the intense heat of heightened perception, until they emerge as something fundamentally different from what they once were. This is the great secret hidden within the apparent curse of overstimulation, that the very quality that can make ordinary life feel unbearable is also the doorway to extraordinary awareness. Jung's principle of Enantiodromia teaches us that all things contain within themselves the seeds of their opposite, that what appears to be one thing has the tendency to transform into something altogether different when viewed from the proper perspective or given sufficient time to unfold its hidden nature. So it is with sensitivity. What begins as overwhelming input gradually reveals itself as the raw material for unprecedented insight. The alchemical fire of stimulation works upon the sensitive psyche in ways that are both invisible and profound. Each sound that cuts too sharply through the awareness, each light that blazes too brightly in the eyes, each texture that feels too rough against the skin, each emotional atmosphere that penetrates too deeply into the heart, all of these serve as sparks in the great furnace of transformation. They burn away the dross of unconsciousness, the comfortable numbness that allows most people to sleepwalk through their days without truly encountering the raw reality of existence. Where others have developed filters that screen out what is deemed irrelevant or excessive, the highly sensitive person remains permeable to the full spectrum of sensory experience. This permeability, while often overwhelming in its intensity, serves a crucial function in the development of consciousness. It prevents the formation of those psychic calluses that, while protective, also serve to deaden our responsiveness to the subtle currents of life that carry the most essential information about our inner and outer worlds. The sensitive person experiences what might be called consciousness without buffer, direct contact with the raw data of existence before it has been processed, filtered, categorized, and filed away by the mechanisms of ordinary awareness. This direct contact is the alchemical fire at work, burning away the comfortable illusions that separate us from immediate experience and forcing a kind of authentic encounter with reality that cannot be avoided or postponed. In the early stages of this process, the fire feels like nothing but torment. The sensitive child learns quickly that the world is too bright, too loud, too fast, too much in every conceivable way. They retreat into quiet corners, seek dim spaces, cover their ears, close their eyes, try desperately to find some respite from the overwhelming assault of sensation. They may be labeled as difficult, withdrawn, overly dramatic, or worse, they may internalize these labels and come to see their sensitivity as a fundamental flaw in their design. Yet even in these early stages, something profound is occurring beneath the surface of apparent overwhelm. The sensitive nervous system is developing capacities that will serve them throughout their lives, the ability to detect subtle changes in environment and atmosphere, to pick up on nuances of emotion and intention that escape ordinary notice, to perceive patterns and connections that exist below the threshold of conventional awareness. They are being forged, whether they know it or not, into instruments of extraordinary perception. The alchemical tradition understood that the process of transformation cannot be rushed, cannot be forced, cannot be made comfortable. The fire must be allowed to do its work at its own pace, in its own way, according to laws that operate beyond the reach of conscious control. Similarly, the highly sensitive person cannot simply will themselves to be less affected by stimulation. The fire of their heightened awareness must be allowed to burn, to transform, to gradually reveal the gold that lies hidden within what appears to be nothing but overwhelming input. This requires a fundamental shift in how sensitivity is understood and approached. Instead of seeing overwhelming stimulation as a problem to be solved, it must be recognized as the very mechanism through which profound transformation occurs. The sensitive person must learn to work with their fire, not against it, to channel its transformative power rather than simply enduring its heat. This is the difference between being consumed by the flame and being refined by it. The process of conscious transformation begins when the sensitive person stops fighting their natural responses and begins to study them instead. What exactly triggers the overwhelm? What patterns can be detected in the rising and falling of stimulation tolerance? What environments, relationships, and activities feed the fire constructively versus destructively? This kind of conscious observation transforms the experience from one of helpless reactivity to one of active participation in their own becoming. As awareness deepens, the sensitive person begins to recognize that their heightened responses to stimulation are providing them with information that is simply not available to those with more filtered perception. They notice the subtle shift in a friend's voice that indicates hidden distress. They feel the energy change when someone enters a room with unresolved conflict. They sense the emotional undercurrents in group dynamics that others miss entirely. What once felt like an overwhelming flood of irrelevant information reveals itself to be a sophisticated early warning system, a form of extrasensory perception that operates through the very sensitivity they once cursed. The alchemical fire transforms not just what is perceived, but how it is perceived. The sensitive person develops what might be called metabolic consciousness, the ability to process complex stimulation not just neurologically but psychologically and spiritually as well. They learn to digest experiences that would overwhelm others, to extract meaning and wisdom from inputs that appear chaotic or excessive. This is the gold that emerges from the lead of overwhelming stimulation, a refined capacity to transform raw experience into conscious understanding. This transformation is particularly evident in how the sensitive person learns to navigate emotional atmospheres where others might notice only the surface presentation, the words being spoken, the obvious emotional displays. The sensitive individual picks up on the entire energetic field. They feel the anxiety that someone is trying to hide, the sadness that underlies apparent happiness, the anger that masquerades as calm control. Initially, this capacity feels like a burden, as they find themselves affected by emotions that aren't even acknowledged to exist. But as consciousness develops, this same capacity becomes a profound gift. The sensitive person becomes a kind of emotional barometer, able to detect the subtle weather patterns of the human heart. They develop an intuitive understanding of what is really happening beneath the surface of social interactions, what needs are being expressed indirectly, what fears are driving apparently inexplicable behaviors. This understanding, refined through the alchemical fire of overstimulation, becomes the basis for unprecedented empathy and wisdom. The principle of Enantiodromia reveals itself most clearly in how hypersensitivity transforms into hyper-awareness. The very neural pathways that make ordinary stimulation feel overwhelming also make subtle stimulation extraordinarily vivid and meaningful. The sensitive person who learns to work with their fire rather than against it discovers that they can perceive beauty, meaning, and connection at levels that most people never access. A piece of music doesn't just sound pleasant, it becomes a direct transmission of emotional truth. A sunset doesn't just look pretty, it becomes a revelation of cosmic beauty. A moment of authentic human connection doesn't just feel good, it becomes a glimpse of the sacred dimension of existence. This transformation is not without its challenges. The alchemical fire burns away not just unconsciousness, but also the comfortable illusions that make ordinary life bearable. The sensitive person may find themselves unable to ignore injustice, unable to participate in superficial social rituals, unable to pretend that things are fine when they clearly aren't. Their refined perception makes them acutely aware of suffering, both their own and others, in ways that can feel overwhelming and isolating. Yet, this same awareness becomes the foundation for authentic engagement with life. Having been forced by their sensitivity to encounter reality directly, without the comfortable filters that most people rely upon, they develop a capacity for genuine presence that is both rare and precious. They cannot sleepwalk through their days because their nervous system won't allow it. They must be awake, aware, responsive to the continuous flow of experience that is life itself. The alchemical fire also transforms the sensitive person's relationship to solitude and stillness. What begins as retreat from overwhelming stimulation gradually evolves into a conscious choice to create space for integration and renewal. They learn that their sensitivity requires not just filtering but also processing, time and space to metabolize the rich feast of experience they consume daily. Solitude becomes not escape, but restoration, not avoidance, but preparation for deeper engagement. In these quiet spaces, away from the bombardment of external stimulation, the sensitive person discovers the subtle internal processes that their heightened awareness makes possible. They notice the delicate shifts in their own emotional landscape, the barely perceptible changes in energy and mood that signal important information about their inner state. They develop a sophisticated internal radar that helps them navigate the complex territory of their own psyche with increasing skill and wisdom. The fire of transformation also works upon the sensitive person's creative capacities. The same neural sensitivity that makes them vulnerable to overstimulation also makes them extraordinarily responsive to beauty, meaning, and inspiration. They may find themselves moved to create, through art, music, writing, or other forms of expression, not as a hobby or profession, but as a necessity, as a way of transforming the overwhelming input of experience into something meaningful and shareable. This creative transformation serves a dual purpose. It provides an outlet for the intense energy that builds up from constant high-level processing of stimulation, and it also serves as a bridge between their inner world and the outer world that often seems so different from their own experience. Through their creative expressions, sensitive individuals can share the gold they have extracted from the fire of their heightened awareness, offering others a glimpse of the beauty and meaning that their refined perception makes visible. The alchemical understanding reminds us that transformation is never a one-time event, but an ongoing process. The sensitive person does not simply overcome their sensitivity and move on to some hypothetical state of normalcy. Instead, they learn to work with the fire as a constant companion, a lifelong partner in the ongoing process of becoming who they are meant to be. Each new level of stimulation, each fresh challenge to their nervous system, becomes another opportunity for refinement and growth. As the process deepens, the sensitive person begins to recognize that their heightened awareness is not just a personal characteristic but a form of service to the larger whole. Their capacity to perceive what others miss, to feel what others cannot access, to process complexity that overwhelms ordinary consciousness. All of this serves not just their own development, but the evolution of consciousness itself. They become pioneers of awareness, scouts of the psyche, explorers of the subtle dimensions of existence that await the awakening of collective human potential. The fire that once seemed like nothing but torment reveals itself to be the very force that forges extraordinary human beings, not extraordinary in the sense of superior, but extraordinary in the sense of being finely tuned instruments of consciousness, capable of perceiving and responding to aspects of reality that remain invisible to less sensitive awareness. They become living proof that what appears to be a liability can be transformed into an asset, that what seems like a curse can become a blessing, that the very quality that makes life difficult can also make it immeasurably rich and meaningful. In the end, the alchemical fire of stimulation serves to burn away everything that is not essential, everything that is not authentic, everything that does not serve the highest expression of the sensitive soul's unique gifts. What emerges from this refining process is not someone who is invulnerable to stimulation, that would be to lose the very quality that makes transformation possible, but someone who has learned to dance with intensity, to surf the waves of sensation, to extract wisdom from what once felt like chaos. This is the gold that the alchemical fire produces, not immunity to stimulation, but mastery of it, not the elimination of sensitivity, but its conscious channeling, not escape from the intensity of awareness, but the skillful navigation of its depths and heights. The highly sensitive person who has undergone this transformation becomes a beacon of possibility, demonstrating that it is indeed possible to feel deeply and live fully, to remain open to life's intensity while maintaining one's center, to transform what appears to be overwhelming into what is actually enlightening. The fire burns on, as it must, for the work of transformation is never complete, but now it burns with purpose, with direction, with the conscious participation of the one who tends it. No longer is it merely overwhelming stimulation. It has become the sacred fire of awakening, the divine flame that continues to refine and purify and transform, moment by moment, sensation by sensation, experience by experience, until the lead of unconscious reactivity has been fully transmuted into the gold of conscious response. At the liminal threshold where consciousness meets the unconscious, where the seen dissolves into the unseen, where the obvious gives way to the hidden, there stands the highly sensitive soul, like a figure at the edge of a vast mirror. This mirror does not reflect the simple surface of things, but reveals the deeper currents that flow beneath the facade of ordinary reality. It shows not what is apparent to casual observation, but what lies concealed in the spaces between words, in the pauses between breaths, in the subtle shifts of energy that most never notice, but which carry the true messages of existence. The heightened awareness of the sensitive person functions as this cosmic mirror, reflecting back dimensions of experience that escape the filtered perception of ordinary consciousness. They stand perpetually at the mirror's edge, seeing not just what is directly in front of them, but the infinite depths that extend beyond and beneath the surface of appearances. This is both their gift and their challenge, to live constantly aware of layers of meaning and significance that others remain blissfully unconscious of, to perceive the hidden emotional weather that shapes every human interaction, to sense the unspoken truths that hover like ghosts around every conversation. Jung understood that consciousness itself is like a mirror, capable of reflecting not just external reality, but the deeper patterns and archetypes that give shape to all experience. For the highly sensitive person, this mirror is polished to an extraordinary degree of clarity and sensitivity. Where others might see only the surface reflection, they perceive the entire depth of the mirror itself, including all the subtle distortions, refractions, and hidden images that exist within its crystalline structure. This capacity for profound reflection manifests in countless ways throughout the sensitive person's daily experience. They notice the micro-expressions that flicker across faces before the socially appropriate mask slides back into place. They feel the emotional temperature of rooms change as different people enter or leave. They sense the unspoken tensions that exist between people who maintain perfectly polite exteriors. They pick up on the energy signatures that individuals carry with them, the residue of recent arguments, the glow of new love, the heaviness of unprocessed grief, the electric charge of suppressed excitement. Standing at the mirror's edge, the sensitive soul becomes a natural interpreter of the symbolic language that life speaks continuously to those who have developed eyes to see and ears to hear. Jung's concept of active imagination, the conscious engagement with the images and symbols that arise from the unconscious, becomes almost involuntary for the highly sensitive person. They cannot help but perceive the metaphorical dimensions of experience, the way that external events mirror internal processes, the way that seemingly random occurrences align to create meaningful patterns and messages. This symbolic perception operates like a form of psychological radar, constantly scanning the environment for information that exists below the threshold of ordinary awareness. The sensitive person might notice how a friend's choice of clothing reflects their current emotional state, how the weather seems to mirror the collective mood of a gathering, how certain songs appear on the radio at precisely the moments when their lyrics carry the most relevance to current life circumstances. What skeptics might dismiss as coincidence or projection, the sensitive soul recognizes as the continuous dialogue between psyche and world, between inner and outer reality. The mirror of heightened awareness reflects not just the present moment, but the multiple layers of time that intersect in every experience. Past, present, and future collapse into a single point of perception for the sensitive observer. They might sense in a new acquaintance the echo of someone from their past, not because of physical resemblance, but because of some deeper energetic signature that transcends the boundaries of linear time. They might feel in the present moment the seeds of future developments, picking up on subtle currents that will eventually manifest as significant changes or events. This temporal fluidity of perception places the sensitive person in a unique position as a bridge between different states of consciousness. They naturally access what Jung called the transcendent function, the capacity to hold opposites in creative tension until a third way emerges. Their awareness moves fluidly between rational analysis and intuitive knowing, between focused attention and diffuse awareness, between personal perspective and transpersonal understanding. They become living demonstrations of the possibility for consciousness to operate on multiple levels simultaneously. The mirror's reflection also reveals the intricate web of connections that links all things in ways that rational thought alone cannot comprehend. The sensitive person perceives these connections not as abstract concepts, but as lived, felt reality. They experience viscerally how their own emotional state affects those around them, how the mood of a group influences individual behavior, how the energy of a place carries the imprint of all who have been there before. This awareness of interconnectedness transforms their understanding of causality from linear to systemic, from mechanical to organic. At the mirror's edge, the boundaries between self and other become increasingly permeable and fluid. The sensitive person may find themselves feeling emotions that don't seem to belong to them, experiencing physical sensations that mirror someone else's condition, knowing things about people that they have no logical way of knowing. This can be deeply unsettling for those who have been taught to believe in the absolute separation of individual consciousness, but it reveals the deeper truth that Jung called the collective unconscious, the shared psychic substrate that connects all human experience. This permeability requires the development of what might be called conscious discernment, the ability to distinguish between what originates from within one's own psyche and what is being absorbed from the environment. The sensitive person must learn to navigate the vast ocean of collective emotional and psychic content without losing their sense of individual identity or becoming overwhelmed by energies that are not their own to process. This is one of the most crucial skills for the highly sensitive person to develop, the capacity to remain open to the full spectrum of subtle perception while maintaining clear boundaries around their own energetic space. The mirror of heightened awareness also reflects the shadow dimensions of experience that most people prefer to ignore or deny. The sensitive person cannot easily avoid seeing the parts of themselves and others that exist outside the comfortable boundaries of the persona. They perceive the anger that lurks beneath excessive politeness, the fear that drives aggressive behavior, the the sadness that hides behind compulsive cheerfulness. This shadow awareness can make social interactions complex and challenging, as the sensitive person must navigate not just what people present consciously, but also what they are unconsciously expressing. Yet this same shadow awareness becomes a profound gift when consciously developed. The sensitive person who learns to work skillfully with shadow material, both their own and others, develops an extraordinary capacity for authentic relationship and genuine healing presence. They can meet people in their wholeness rather than just their personas, offering the rare gift of acceptance for all dimensions of human nature. This makes them natural counselors, healers, and wisdom keepers, able to hold space for the full complexity of human experience without judgment or rejection. The mirror's edge is also where the sensitive soul encounters the numinous, those moments of transcendent meaning and sacred encounter that Jung recognized as essential to psychological health and spiritual development. Because their perception is naturally attuned to subtle dimensions of experience, sensitive individuals are more likely to recognize and respond to these moments when they arise. A conversation becomes a revelation, a walk in nature becomes a mystical experience, a piece of art becomes a direct transmission of divine beauty. They live more frequently in what the mystics call the eternal now, that timeless space where the sacred reveals itself through ordinary experience. This capacity for numinous encounter requires careful cultivation and integration. The sensitive person may find themselves overwhelmed by the intensity of these experiences, unsure how to ground them in practical reality or communicate them to others who have not shared similar encounters. They must learn to serve as bridges between the transcendent and the mundane, finding ways to bring the insights and energies they access at the mirror's edge back into ordinary life, in ways that serve both their own development and the larger community. The heightened awareness of the sensitive person also functions as an early warning system for collective psychological and spiritual trends. Like canaries in coal mines, they often begin experiencing the effects of cultural toxicity, spiritual emptiness, or collective shadow projection long before these patterns become obvious to mainstream awareness. Their sensitivity makes them natural barometers of collective psychological health, registering disturbances in the cultural atmosphere that may not become apparent to others for months or years. This prophetic dimension of sensitivity can be both isolating and empowering. The sensitive person may find themselves responding to threats that others cannot yet perceive, experiencing anxiety or distress that seems disproportionate to immediate circumstances, but which later proves to have been an accurate reading of underlying conditions. Learning to trust this intuitive awareness, while also maintaining perspective and emotional balance, becomes crucial for their psychological well-being and their effectiveness as early warning systems for their communities. At the mirror's edge, the sensitive soul also encounters the profound responsibility that comes with heightened awareness. Having been given the gift of seeing more deeply, feeling more acutely, and perceiving more subtly, they face the ongoing question of how to use these gifts in service of the larger whole. This responsibility cannot be taken lightly, for awareness without wisdom can become a source of suffering for both the sensitive person and those around them. The development of wisdom requires learning to discern when to speak and when to remain silent, when to intervene and when to witness, when to absorb emotional energy and when to deflect it. The sensitive person must become skilled in the art of conscious choice, learning to respond rather than simply react to the constant stream of subtle information they receive. This requires developing what Jung called the transcendent function, the capacity to hold tension consciously until new possibilities emerge. The mirror of heightened awareness ultimately reflects the fundamental interconnectedness and meaning that underlies all existence. The sensitive person, standing perpetually at its edge, becomes a living reminder of depths and dimensions that materialistic consciousness tends to overlook or dismiss. They serve as bridges between worlds, translators of subtle languages, interpreters of symbolic communications that flow continuously between psyche and cosmos. Their gift is not just personal but transpersonal, not just individual but collective. By developing conscious relationship with their heightened awareness, by learning to navigate skillfully at the mirror's edge, they contribute to the evolution of consciousness itself. They demonstrate that it is possible to live simultaneously in multiple dimensions of reality, to perceive both surface and depth, to maintain practical effectiveness while remaining open to transcendent possibility. The mirror's edge is ultimately revealed to be not a place of separation but of integration, not a boundary but a meeting point where all dimensions of existence converge. The sensitive person who learns to stand consciously at this edge becomes a master of integration, capable of weaving together the many threads of awareness into a coherent and meaningful whole. They become living examples of what becomes possible when human consciousness develops beyond the limitations of ordinary filtered perception into the boundless territories of awakened awareness. In this state of integrated sensitivity, the mirror no longer reflects just what is external, but becomes a window into the infinite depths of consciousness itself. The highly sensitive person discovers that they are not separate from what they perceive but intimately connected to it all, not observers standing apart, but participants in the vast dance of awareness, reflecting upon itself through countless forms and expressions. This is the ultimate gift of standing at the mirror's edge, the recognition that consciousness and its contents are one, that perceiver and perceived are aspects of a single, magnificent, ever-unfolding whole. In the sacred chambers of transformation, where caterpillars surrender their familiar forms to emerge as creatures of flight and color, there exists a profound parallel to the psychological metamorphosis that occurs within the perfectionistic cocoon of the highly sensitive soul. This is not the crude perfectionism of mere achievement, or the shallow perfectionism of external validation, but something far more complex and meaningful, a cocoon woven from threads of exquisite attention to detail, deep processing of experience, and an almost mystical attunement to the subtle harmonies that govern authentic excellence. The perfectionism of the highly sensitive person emerges from the same neural architecture that makes them acutely aware of nuance, subtlety, and the infinite gradations between good and extraordinary. Their nervous system, calibrated to detect the finest variations in stimulation, naturally extends this sensitivity into their own creative and productive endeavors. They feel viscerally when something is not quite right, when a detail is out of place, when the wholeness they envision has not yet been achieved. This is both their chrysalis and their potential wings, the very quality that can imprison them in endless cycles of self-criticism and revision, yet also holds the seeds of their greatest gifts to the world. To understand the chrysalis of perfectionism, we must first recognize that it serves a necessary protective function during a crucial stage of psychological development. Like the biological chrysalis that shields the dissolving caterpillar from external threats, while the miraculous reorganization of cells occurs within, perfectionism creates a psychological container for the sensitive soul's intense process of becoming. It provides structure and focus for their abundant creative energies, channels their deep processing capabilities towards specific goals, and offers a sense of control in a world that often feels chaotic and overwhelming. Within this protective shell, the sensitive person's relationship with detail and precision develops into something approaching the sacred. They cannot help but notice when elements are out of alignment, when colors don't harmonize, when words don't capture the precise meaning intended, when actions don't reflect their deepest values. This noticing is not optional. It is built into the very fabric of their awareness. They experience imperfection not as a minor inconvenience, but as a form of discord that reverberates through their entire being, demanding attention and resolution. The perfectionist chrysalis often forms early in the sensitive person's life as a response to their acute awareness of how differently they process and respond to the world. Recognizing that their natural reactions are often more intense, more detailed, more complex than those around them, they may unconsciously develop perfectionism as a way to justify and validate their different way of being. If they cannot be normal, they reason, at least they can be excellent. If they cannot be like everyone else, at least they can be better. This protective strategy initially serves them well, channeling their natural gifts toward achievements that earn recognition and acceptance. The sensitive child who becomes the perfect student, the meticulous artist, the conscientious helper discovers that their attention to detail and deep processing can be transformed into social currency. Their perfectionism becomes both armor and currency, protecting them from criticism while earning them appreciation for their exceptional work. Yet, as the psychological metamorphosis deepens, the very qualities that once provided protection begin to feel increasingly constraining. The chrysalis that once felt safe begins to feel suffocating. The standards that once provided direction begin to feel impossible to meet. The attention to detail that once felt like a gift begins to feel like a curse that prevents anything from ever being finished, ever being good enough, ever being worthy of release into the world. This is the critical phase of transformation within the perfectionist chrysalis, the point at which the sensitive soul must choose between remaining safe but limited within their protective shell, or undergoing the vulnerable process of emergence that will allow their true gifts to unfold, like the butterfly that must struggle to break free from its cocoon, a struggle that is necessary to develop the strength required for flight. The sensitive person must learn to work with their perfectionism rather than being trapped by it. The shadow side of perfectionism manifests as a relentless inner critic that speaks in the language of never enough. No matter how much care is taken, how many revisions are made, how much effort is invested, this inner voice finds flaws, suggests improvements, demands just one more adjustment before the work can be considered complete. This critic often carries the voices of early caregivers, teachers, or peers who failed to understand the sensitive child's natural way of processing and responding to the world. The inner critic of the perfectionist is particularly cruel because it uses the sensitive person's own gifts against them. Their natural ability to perceive subtle flaws and imperfections becomes weaponized in service of self-attack. Their deep processing capabilities become trapped in endless loops of analysis and revision. Their capacity for envisioning ideal outcomes becomes a source of perpetual disappointment with what is actually achievable within the constraints of time, resources, and human limitation. Yet within this same shadow lies the seed of profound transformation. The sensitive person's relationship with perfectionism must undergo what Jung called Enantiodromia, the tendency of psychological contents to transform into their opposites when taken to extremes. The perfectionism that once paralyzed must become the foundation for authentic excellence. The criticism that once destroyed must become the discernment that creates. The standards that once felt impossible must become the vision that inspires. This transformation begins with recognizing perfectionism not as a moral failing or psychological weakness, but as a misguided expression of something sacred, the soul's deep longing for beauty, truth, and authentic expression. The perfectionist impulse, when traced to its roots, reveals itself to be motivated not by ego or vanity, but by a profound reverence for the potential that exists within every creative act, every relationship, every moment of conscious choice. The sensitive person trapped in perfectionist paralysis must learn to distinguish between the perfectionism that serves creation and the perfectionism that prevents it. True perfectionism, what might be called divine perfectionism, is not about eliminating all flaws, but about honoring the inherent perfection that exists within each stage of the creative process. It recognizes that the seed is perfect as a seed, even though it is not yet a flower, and that the flower is perfect as a flower, even though it is not yet fruit. This distinction requires developing what can only be called process consciousness, an awareness that focuses not just on outcomes, but on the quality of attention and intention brought to each moment of creative engagement. The sensitive person learns to find perfection, not in the elimination of all imperfections, but in the wholehearted presence they bring to their work, the integrity of their engagement with the creative process, the authenticity of their expression, regardless of how others might receive it. As this consciousness develops, the chrysalis of perfectionism begins to soften and become permeable. The rigid standards that once felt like prison walls transform into flexible guidelines that support rather than constrain the creative process. The inner critic begins to evolve into an inner ally, still discerning, still attentive to quality and detail, but now serving the larger purpose of authentic expression, rather than the smaller purpose of ego protection. The sensitive person discovers that their natural attention to detail and deep processing capabilities, when liberated from the shadow of perfectionism, become extraordinary tools for crafting work of genuine excellence and beauty. They realize that their capacity to perceive subtle flaws and imperfections can be channeled into an almost mystical ability to sense when something is truly complete, when it has achieved its own inherent perfection, regardless of how it might compare to external standards or ideal visions. This transformation often involves a profound shift in how completion and release are understood. The perfectionist is trapped by the fantasy that more time, more effort, more revision will eventually produce something flawless. The evolved sensitive person recognizes that completion comes not when all possible improvements have been made, but when the work has achieved its own organic wholeness, when it has become what it was meant to be rather than what they thought it should be. The metaphor of the butterfly's emergence becomes particularly relevant here. The butterfly does not emerge from its chrysalis because it has achieved some predetermined standard of perfection, but because the time for emergence has arrived. Its wings may be slightly asymmetrical, its colors may vary from some theoretical ideal, but it is complete in its own unique way. Similarly, the creative works and expressions that emerge from the transformed perfectionist chrysalis carry their own organic perfection, flawed by external standards perhaps, but whole in their authentic expression of the creator's inner truth. This emergence requires tremendous courage, for it means releasing control over how the work will be received, what impact it will have, whether it will meet the expectations of others or even of the creator's own ego. The sensitive person must learn to trust that their natural gifts, their attention to detail, their deep processing, their capacity for subtle perception will guide them toward expressions that serve not just their own growth, but the larger purposes of beauty, truth, and connection. The chrysalis of perfectionism also transforms the sensitive person's relationship with criticism and feedback. Where once external criticism felt like confirmation of their deepest fears about their inadequacy, they now learn to receive feedback as information rather than judgment. Their refined perception allows them to distinguish between criticism that serves growth and criticism that serves only to wound, between suggestions that honor their intention and suggestions that would distort their authentic expression. This discernment becomes particularly important because the work that emerges from the transformed perfectionist chrysalis is often quite different from conventional expectations. The sensitive person's deep processing and attention to subtlety may produce expressions that challenge ordinary sensibilities, that require more careful attention to appreciate, that reveal their beauty and wisdom only to those willing to engage with the same depth and presence that went into their creation. The transformation of perfectionism also affects how the sensitive person approaches collaboration and relationship. The perfectionist tendency to control every detail must give way to a more fluid and responsive way of engaging with others. They learn that authentic excellence often emerges not from individual perfection, but from the synergy that arises when different gifts and perspectives are allowed to interact and influence each other in organic ways. This evolution requires releasing the fantasy of perfect understanding, perfect communication, perfect harmony in favor of something more realistic and ultimately more satisfying, authentic relationship that honors both individual uniqueness and collective purpose. The sensitive person's gifts for perceiving subtlety and processing complexity become assets in navigation of these more fluid collaborative dynamics, rather than sources of frustration when others don't match their standards or approach. As the chrysalis continues to dissolve, the sensitive person often experiences a profound shift in their understanding of purpose and meaning. The perfectionist is driven by the fantasy that perfect work will lead to perfect outcomes, universal appreciation, lasting fulfillment, final resolution of their sense of inadequacy. The evolved sensitive person recognizes that the purpose of their gifts is not to achieve perfection, but to participate authentically in the ongoing creative evolution of consciousness itself. This shift from perfectionism to participation transforms everything. Work becomes not a test to be passed, but a dance to be danced. Creative expression becomes not a product to be judged, but a gift to be offered. Relationships become not performances to be perfected, but encounters to be honored. Life itself becomes not a problem to be solved, but a mystery to be lived with presence, courage, and authentic engagement. The butterfly that emerges from the chrysalis of perfectionism carries within its wings not the elimination of high standards, but their transformation into something far more beautiful and meaningful. These are no longer the rigid standards of comparison and competition, but the organic standards of wholeness, authenticity, and service to something larger than the individual ego. The sensitive person discovers that their natural gifts, when freed from the prison of perfectionism, become instruments of genuine excellence, excellence that serves not just personal achievement, but the larger purposes of beauty, healing, and awakening. In the end, the chrysalis of perfectionism reveals itself to have been not an obstacle to overcome, but a necessary stage in the development of the sensitive soul's greatest gifts. Like all chrysalises, it serves its purpose and then dissolves, leaving behind not perfection in the conventional sense, but something far more precious, the capacity to engage with life with such presence, such authenticity, such skillful attention to detail and quality, that every expression becomes a small miracle of conscious creation. The butterfly carries its chrysalis experience within every cell, not as limitation but as foundation. The sensitive person who has undergone this transformation carries their perfectionist past not as shame but as the very quality that enables them to perceive and create with extraordinary precision and beauty. They become living demonstrations that it is possible to maintain the highest standards while releasing attachment to outcomes, to care deeply about quality, while accepting the organic imperfections that make each expression unique and alive. This is the final gift of the chrysalis, the recognition that true perfection lies not in the elimination of flaws, but in the wholehearted embrace of one's authentic nature, with all its sensitive complexities and exquisite attention to the subtle harmonies that make life beautiful. The metamorphosis is complete, not when perfection is achieved, but when the need for perfection is transcended in favor of something infinitely more valuable. The courage to be authentically oneself in service of the larger dance of becoming that is existence itself. There exists within the human soul a paradox so profound that it defies the rational mind's attempts to grasp it wholly. It is the mystery of the sacred wound, that tender place where our greatest vulnerability becomes the wellspring of our deepest wisdom. For those who walk the path of heightened sensitivity, this paradox is not merely philosophical speculation, but lived reality, carved into the very marrow of their being through encounters with a world that often mistakes their openness for weakness, their depth for deficiency. In the ancient stories that Jung so cherished, we find the archetype of the wounded healer, Chiron, struck by Heracles' arrow, unable to heal himself yet possessing the power to heal all others. This mythic figure represents something far more than poetic metaphor. It speaks to a fundamental truth about the nature of consciousness itself. The wound, when properly understood and integrated, becomes the very source of one's healing power. But for the highly sensitive soul, this integration demands a journey through territories that others might never need to traverse. When criticism falls upon the average person, it may sting momentarily before being forgotten or dismissed. But when that same arrow of judgment strikes the sensitive being, it penetrates layers of consciousness that remain hidden to most. It travels not merely to the ego, that protective shell we present to the world, but directly into the tender realm of the authentic self, that core essence that Jung recognized as the true center of our being. The sensitive person feels criticism not as an external assessment, but as a direct assault upon their very existence. This is because their psychic boundaries, those invisible barriers that separate self from world, are naturally more permeable. What others experience as separate from themselves, the sensitive soul experiences as intimately connected to their inner landscape. A harsh word becomes an earthquake in their psychological terrain. A dismissive gesture reverberates through chambers of their heart that they didn't even know existed. Yet this same permeability that makes them so vulnerable to wounding also grants them access to realms of experience that remain closed to those with thicker psychological armor. They feel not only their own pain, but the pain of the world itself. They sense the unspoken sorrows of those around them, the collective wounds of humanity that pulse beneath the surface of ordinary interaction. This is both their burden and their gift, to serve as sensitive instruments that register the subtlest vibrations of the human condition. In Jung's understanding, the psyche naturally seeks balance through what he called Enantiodromia, the tendency for things to transform into their opposite when taken to extremes. The sensitive person's journey through criticism and rejection often follows this ancient pattern. What begins as devastating vulnerability gradually transforms into profound compassion. What starts as overwhelming pain slowly alchemizes into healing wisdom. But this transformation is neither automatic nor painless. It requires a conscious engagement with the wound, a willingness to descend into the darkness of rejection and emerge with treasures that can only be found in such depths. The sensitive soul must learn to hold the tension between their natural openness and their need for psychological protection, between their gift for feeling deeply and their requirement for inner stability. When the world rejects what the sensitive person offers, their insights, their art, their way of being, it strikes at the very heart of their purpose. For these souls do not simply have sensitivity, they are sensitivity incarnate. Their entire being is organized around the principle of receptivity, of taking in and transforming experience through the delicate mechanisms of their inner life. To reject their offering is to reject their fundamental nature, their way of contributing to the great conversation of existence. The pain of such rejection goes beyond personal hurt. It carries with it a cosmic dimension, a sense that something sacred has been wounded. This is because the sensitive person often serves as a vessel for archetypal energies, those universal patterns that Jung recognized as the deep structures of human experience. When they create or express or simply exist in their authentic sensitivity, they are channeling forces far greater than their individual personality. Yet the world, in its unconsciousness, often cannot recognize this sacred function. It sees only what appears to be weakness, fragility, or difference. It responds with the crude tools of criticism and rejection, not understanding that it is wounding something far more precious than a mere individual ego. It is injuring a conduit through which beauty, wisdom, and healing might flow into collective consciousness. The sensitive person learns, through repeated encounters with misunderstanding, to question their own nature. They begin to wonder if there is something fundamentally wrong with their way of being, if their depth is actually shallowness, if their receptivity is merely self-indulgence. This is the beginning of what Jung called the dark night of the soul, a period of profound disorientation in which all that once seemed certain crumbles into doubt. In this darkness, the sensitive being faces a crucial choice. They can attempt to harden themselves, to build thicker walls and deaden their receptivity in service of psychological survival. Many take this path, and who could blame them? The world rewards those who can maintain emotional distance, who can function effectively without being overwhelmed by the subtle currents of human experience. But for the truly sensitive soul, this path of hardening leads only to a kind of spiritual death. To close themselves off from feeling is to cut themselves off from their own life force, their unique contribution to the world's healing. They become walking ghosts, present in body, but absent in spirit, protecting themselves so thoroughly that nothing of their essential nature can shine through. The other path, the way of conscious integration, demands something far more challenging than simple hardening. It requires the development of what Jung called the transcendent function, the capacity to hold opposites in creative tension without collapsing into either extreme. For the sensitive person, this means learning to remain open while also maintaining boundaries, to feel deeply while also preserving their own psychological integrity. This is not merely a matter of emotional management or psychological technique. It is a spiritual discipline, a way of being that honors both the gift of sensitivity and the necessity of self-preservation. It involves developing a relationship with one's wound that neither denies its reality nor allows it to define one's entire existence. The sacred wound, when approached with consciousness, becomes a teacher of extraordinary depth. It shows the sensitive soul where their energy leaks away into others' opinions, where their sense of self becomes dependent upon external validation, where their authentic nature has become contaminated by the need to please or perform or prove their worth. Through the fire of criticism and rejection, the sensitive person learns to distinguish between their essential self and their persona, that mask we wear in social interaction. They discover that what others reject is often not their true nature, but rather their attempts to conform to expectations that were never meant for them. The criticism that cuts so deeply is frequently aimed at the very places where they have abandoned their authenticity in favor of acceptability. This realization brings with it a profound liberation. If what others reject is not their true self, but rather their false adaptations, then the rejection itself becomes a gift, a painful but necessary correction that calls them back to their authentic nature. The sacred wound begins to reveal its healing purpose, to strip away everything that is not essentially them, to burn off the dross of conditioning and reveal the gold of their true being. Yet this understanding does not make the pain disappear overnight. The sensitive soul must still navigate a world that often rewards conformity over authenticity, emotional numbness over depth, surface efficiency over meaningful connection. They must find ways to honor their nature while also meeting the practical demands of existence in a culture that frequently values the very qualities they lack. This navigation requires the development of what might be called sacred discernment, the ability to sense which environments and relationships support their authentic expression and which drain their life force through subtle forms of rejection and criticism. They learn to seek out those rare souls who recognize and value their gifts, while also developing the strength to stand alone when necessary. The wounded healer archetype becomes lived reality as the sensitive person discovers that their own journey through pain and rejection has prepared them to offer something unique to others who suffer. They become able to sit with another's anguish without trying to fix or change it, to offer presence rather than solutions, to create spaces where vulnerability is welcomed rather than shamed. Their capacity to feel criticism and rejection so deeply paradoxically develops into an extraordinary ability to offer acceptance and understanding. Having experienced the full weight of human judgment, they become less likely to judge others. Having felt the pain of being misunderstood, they develop an almost supernatural capacity to see and appreciate the hidden gifts in those around them. This transformation is not a simple linear progression from wounded to healer. It is a spiral dance in which each new encounter with criticism or rejection offers an opportunity for deeper integration, greater wisdom, more refined discernment. The sensitive soul learns that their wound is not something to be cured, but rather something to be continually transformed through conscious relationship. In Jung's understanding, individuation, the process of becoming who we truly are, requires us to face and integrate all aspects of our nature, including those that bring us pain. For the sensitive person, this means embracing their vulnerability, not as weakness but as strength, their emotional depth, not as burden but as gift, their tendency toward introspection, not as self-indulgence but as sacred practice. The world needs what the sensitive soul offers, even when it cannot recognize or value that offering. In an age of increasing disconnection and emotional numbness, those who maintain their capacity to feel deeply serve as essential bridges between the human and the divine, the conscious and the unconscious, the wounded and the whole. Their sacred wound becomes a source of blessing not only for themselves, but for all those whose lives they touch through their transformed understanding. They become living proof that our greatest weakness, when consciously embraced and integrated, can become our most powerful gift to the world. The path through criticism and rejection leads, ultimately, to a profound spiritual maturity, the ability to remain true to one's deepest nature, regardless of external validation or rejection. This is not the brittle independence of the ego protecting itself, but rather the flexible strength of the soul that has learned to draw its sustenance from inner wells of meaning and purpose. In the end, the sensitive person discovers that their wound was sacred, not because it was special or different, but because it was theirs, uniquely designed to crack them open in precisely the ways they needed to be opened, to teach them exactly the lessons their soul required for its full flowering. The criticism and rejection that once seemed like evidence of their inadequacy reveal themselves as the very experiences that shaped them into vessels capable of holding and transmitting the deepest truths of human existence. Through their journey with the sacred wound, they learn that healing is not about becoming invulnerable, but about developing the capacity to be vulnerable with wisdom, to be open with discernment, to offer their gifts with courage, even in the face of a world that does not always recognize their value. They become wounded healers in the truest sense, not despite their sensitivity, but because of it, transformed by their pain into agents of transformation for others who walk similar paths. The sacred wound, fully embraced and consciously integrated, becomes the birthplace of the sensitive soul's greatest contribution to the world. The gift of compassionate presence, the ability to hold space for others' pain, and the wisdom that comes only from having traveled through the dark territories of rejection and emerged with one's essential nature, not only intact but purified and strengthened by the journey. In this way, what began as personal suffering transforms into universal blessing, and the sensitive person fulfills their deepest purpose to serve as a healing presence in a world that desperately needs their particular medicine, their unique way of seeing and being, and offering the treasures found only in the depths of a heart that has been broken open and learned to love not less, but more. In the beginning was the Word, and mystics throughout the ages have understood that this primordial Word continues to speak itself through the infinite languages of beauty that surround us. Yet not all ears are attuned to hear these subtle conversations. Not all eyes are prepared to witness the sacred dialogue between form and meaning that unfolds in every moment. The highly sensitive soul possesses a rare gift, an aesthetic sensitivity so refined that it serves not merely as appreciation for the beautiful, but as a direct line of communication with the archetypal realm itself. Jung understood that beauty was far more than mere decoration or pleasant sensation. In his exploration of the psyche's depths, he discovered that our response to beauty connects us to the fundamental patterns of existence, to what he called the collective unconscious, that vast reservoir of shared human experience that expresses itself through symbols, myths, and the eternal forms that appear again and again throughout history and across cultures. For the sensitive person, beauty is not optional luxury, but essential nourishment. Their soul requires it, as the body requires air or water. They do not simply enjoy beautiful things, they commune with them, entering into relationship with the essence that shines through aesthetic form. A sunset becomes conversation with the divine, a piece of music becomes prayer made audible, a painting becomes window into dimensions of reality that ordinary consciousness cannot access. This is why the sensitive being often finds themselves overwhelmed in environments of aesthetic poverty, those stark functional spaces that prioritize efficiency over soul, utility over meaning. What others might dismiss as mere personal preference reveals itself, upon deeper examination, as a fundamental requirement for psychological and spiritual well-being. The sensitive soul withers in ugliness, not from superficial vanity, but from actual spiritual malnutrition. Consider how the sensitive person experiences a moment of natural beauty, perhaps the way morning light filters through leaves, creating patterns of shadow and illumination that dance across the forest floor. Where others might notice and appreciate this scene briefly before moving on, the sensitive soul becomes arrested by its significance. They sense in this interplay of light and shadow something far more profound than mere physical phenomenon. They are witnessing, through their aesthetic perception, the eternal dance of opposites that Jung recognized as fundamental to all existence: light and dark, conscious and unconscious, known and unknown. The beauty they perceive carries within it the entire mystery of existence, the cosmic principles that govern both outer nature and inner psychological reality. Their aesthetic sensitivity becomes a form of mystical perception, a way of reading the sacred text that is continuously being written across the face of creation. This is not metaphorical or poetic exaggeration. The sensitive person's brain actually processes aesthetic information differently, creating neural pathways that connect sensory input directly to the deeper centers of meaning and emotion. When they encounter beauty, multiple systems of understanding activate simultaneously: emotional, symbolic, archetypal, spiritual. They do not simply see a beautiful object. They experience a revelation. Music, perhaps more than any other art form, demonstrates this profound connection between aesthetic sensitivity and spiritual awareness. When the sensitive soul encounters a piece of music that speaks to their depths, they are not merely hearing sounds arranged in pleasing patterns. They are receiving direct transmission from the realm Jung called the collective unconscious, those universal themes and emotions that unite all human experience across time and culture. A single musical phrase can transport them instantly into states of consciousness that others might spend years of meditation trying to achieve. The way a violin's voice breaks with longing, the manner in which a piano's notes cascade like tears or laughter, the profound silence between movements that contains more meaning than words could ever convey. These become gateways into dimensions of experience that transform their understanding of what it means to be human. The sensitive person often struggles to explain why certain music affects them so powerfully. They may find themselves moved to tears by a melody they've never heard before, feeling homesick for a place they've never been, grieving for losses they cannot name. This is because music in its purest form speaks the native language of the soul, that wordless communication that existed before human speech, and that will continue long after all our civilizations have crumbled to dust. Through their aesthetic sensitivity, they access what Jung termed the transcendent function, the psyche's natural capacity to bridge opposites and create new understanding from the tension between seemingly contradictory truths. Beautiful art often works precisely by holding paradox in perfect balance, by saying what cannot be said through conventional means, by revealing truths too large for logical comprehension. The sensitive soul recognizes instinctively that great art does not seek to resolve life's mysteries, but to deepen them, to make them more beautiful, more compelling, more worthy of our wonder. They understand without need for explanation that the purpose of aesthetic experience is not to provide answers, but to refine our questions, to make us more capable of living productively with uncertainty and ambiguity. This is why they often prefer art that others find difficult or challenging, while the general public gravitates towards aesthetic experiences that confirm what they already know and feel. The sensitive person seeks out beauty that expands their capacity for feeling and knowing. They are drawn to art that asks something of them, that demands growth, that refuses to let them remain unchanged by the encounter. Their aesthetic preferences reveal not merely personal taste, but deep psychological structure, the colors that draw them, the forms that speak to their hearts, the musical intervals that make their souls soar. These preferences map the architecture of their inner world, the specific configuration of archetypal energies that makes them unique expressions of universal human potential. Jung observed that certain symbols and aesthetic forms appear repeatedly across cultures and throughout history because they correspond to fundamental structures of the human psyche. The sensitive person, with their refined aesthetic perception, serves as a kind of living receiver for these universal patterns. They recognize, often without conscious understanding, when an aesthetic experience carries archetypal weight, when it connects them to something larger than individual experience. This is why they may find themselves profoundly moved by ancient art forms, by Gothic cathedrals that reach toward heaven, by Greek temples that embody perfect proportion, by cave paintings that capture the eternal human relationship with mystery and meaning. Their aesthetic sensitivity allows them to feel across time, to commune with the souls of artists and builders and dreamers who lived centuries or millennia ago, but who shared the same deep human longings for beauty, meaning, and transcendence. In their response to natural beauty, this archetypal dimension becomes even more apparent. The sensitive soul does not simply enjoy a beautiful landscape, they experience it as a direct encounter with the creative principle itself. They sense in nature's forms and patterns the same organizing intelligence that shapes their own psychological development, the same wisdom that guides the unfolding of their personal individuation process. A mountain becomes symbol of aspiration and stability, its peak representing the goal of consciousness reaching toward light, while its base remains grounded in earth. A flowing river speaks of time's passage and the eternal movement of life energy through all forms. An ancient tree embodies the axis mundi, that central pillar connecting heaven and earth, conscious and unconscious, human and divine. These are not fanciful interpretations imposed upon neutral natural phenomena. They are direct perceptions of the symbolic dimension that Jung recognized as constantly present in all experience, though visible only to those whose perception has been refined enough to see beyond the merely literal level of existence. The sensitive person's aesthetic appreciation extends beyond traditionally recognized art forms to include the subtle beauties that permeate ordinary existence. They notice the way light falls across a wall at a particular time of day, creating momentary masterpieces that exist only for those present to witness them. They perceive the inadvertent poetry in overheard conversations, the unconscious grace in how someone moves through space, the profound beauty in moments of authentic human connection. This capacity to find aesthetic value in unexpected places reflects their fundamental orientation toward meaning rather than mere function. Where others see only utility, they discover significance. Where others perceive only randomness, they sense pattern. Where others experience only separation, they feel connection to the vast web of relationships that connects all existence. Yet this gift of aesthetic sensitivity carries with it particular challenges and responsibilities. Living in a world that often prioritizes efficiency over beauty, speed over contemplation, novelty over depth, the sensitive soul must constantly navigate between their authentic aesthetic needs and the demands of practical existence. They may find themselves exhausted by environments designed without consideration for the human soul's requirements for beauty and meaning. Modern urban landscapes, with their emphasis on function over form, their harsh lighting and geometric severity, their absence of natural elements, can feel like aesthetic assault to the sensitive consciousness. Similarly, they may struggle in social environments where beauty is dismissed as frivolous luxury, where aesthetic sensitivity is viewed as impractical self-indulgence, where their need for environments that nourish the soul is misunderstood as excessive pickiness or difficult temperament. The sensitive person learns to become archaeologist of beauty, seeking out those hidden pockets of aesthetic nourishment that exist even in the most unlikely places. They develop the ability to create beauty around themselves through small acts of aesthetic attention, arranging objects with care, choosing colors that speak to their souls, surrounding themselves with images and sounds that connect them to deeper dimensions of meaning. This becomes a form of spiritual practice, a way of maintaining connection to the archetypal realm, even in environments that seem hostile to such connection. They understand intuitively that their aesthetic choices are not mere decoration, but essential tools for psychological and spiritual survival. Their aesthetic sensitivity also reveals itself in their response to human beauty, not merely physical attractiveness, though that may be part of it, but the deeper beauty that shines through authentic expression, genuine emotion, and unguarded presence. They are often more moved by a moment of real laughter, honest tears, or unconscious grace than by conventional standards of physical perfection. This capacity to perceive beauty in authenticity makes them natural artists and healers, drawn to create spaces and experiences that allow others to connect with their own essential beauty. They understand that everyone carries within them seeds of aesthetic potential, capacities for creating and appreciating beauty that may be dormant but never entirely absent. Through their own aesthetic sensitivity, they serve as midwives for others' creative potential, helping to birth new forms of beauty into the world. Their refined perception becomes gift not only to themselves but to all those whose lives they touch through their commitment to honoring and creating aesthetic value. The sensitive soul often finds themselves called to be guardians of beauty in a world that frequently treats aesthetic considerations as expendable luxury. They become the ones who notice when something beautiful is being destroyed, who speak up for the preservation of environments and traditions that carry aesthetic and spiritual significance, who resist the flattening of experience into purely functional terms. This guardianship extends beyond external preservation to include the cultivation and protection of their own aesthetic sensitivity. They learn to treat their refined perception as sacred gift, requiring careful tending and conscious development. They seek out experiences that refine rather than coarsen their aesthetic capacity, relationships that honor rather than dismiss their sensitivity to beauty, environments that nourish rather than deplete their soul's requirements for meaningful aesthetic experience. In doing so, they discover that aesthetic sensitivity is not static gift but dynamic capacity that can be endlessly deepened and refined. Each encounter with beauty has the potential to increase their capacity for future aesthetic experience. Each moment of aesthetic attention becomes practice in the art of perceiving the sacred within the ordinary, the eternal within the temporal, the infinite within the finite. Through their commitment to aesthetic sensitivity as spiritual practice, they develop what might be called aesthetic wisdom, the ability to discern which forms of beauty truly nourish the soul and which merely stimulate the senses, which aesthetic experiences connect them to deeper meaning, and which distract from authentic encounter with mystery. This wisdom guides them toward what Jung might have called aesthetic individuation, the development of their unique capacity to perceive, create, and share beauty in ways that reflect their essential nature, while also serving the greater aesthetic needs of their community and culture. Their garden of subtle beauty becomes not private indulgence but sacred offering, a way of contributing to the world's healing through the cultivation and sharing of experiences that remind others of what makes life worth living, what connects us to dimensions of meaning beyond mere survival, what allows the human soul to flourish rather than merely endure. In the end, the sensitive person's aesthetic sensitivity reveals itself as form of love, love for the world in all its potential beauty, love for the creative principle that expresses itself through infinite forms, love for the human capacity to perceive and create meaning through aesthetic experience. Their refined perception becomes instrument through which the universe contemplates its own beauty, appreciates its own creativity, and celebrates its own endless capacity for generating new forms of meaning and delight. Through their sensitive souls, beauty becomes conscious of itself, and consciousness discovers its own aesthetic dimension. The garden of subtle beauty that they cultivate through their refined aesthetic sensitivity becomes sacred space where the human and divine meet, where the personal and universal intersect, where the wound of separation heals through direct experience of connection to the creative principle that underlies all existence. In tending this garden with conscious care and devoted attention, the sensitive soul fulfills one of their deepest purposes, to serve as living bridge between the realm of pure aesthetic potential and its manifestation in forms that can touch and transform human hearts, awakening in others the same capacity for perceiving beauty that has become their own most precious gift and sacred responsibility. In the deepest chambers of the psyche, where consciousness dissolves into the primordial waters of the unconscious, there exists a symphony that plays without instruments, a music that resonates through the very fabric of existence itself. It is here, in this sacred space beyond the reach of rational thought, that certain souls discover their most profound gift, the ability to hear what others cannot, to know what has not been spoken, to perceive the invisible threads that weave through the tapestry of human experience. You who have walked this path of exquisite sensitivity know this symphony well, though you may have spent years questioning its reality, doubting its validity, wondering if the melodies you hear are mere fantasies of an overactive imagination. But what if I were to tell you that this capacity to tune into the unconscious frequencies of existence is not madness, but mastery, not delusion, but deep seeing? What if the very thing you have been taught to mistrust is actually your greatest treasure? Jung himself knew this symphony intimately. In the pages of his Red Book, he chronicled his own descent into the unconscious depths, where he encountered figures and wisdom that could not be explained by the rational mind. He called it his confrontation with the unconscious, but perhaps it would be more accurate to say it was his initiation into a way of knowing that transcends the limitations of surface consciousness. Like you, he discovered that there are forms of knowledge that arrive not through study or analysis, but through a kind of psychic osmosis, an absorption of truth that happens at levels far below the threshold of ordinary awareness. This is the realm of intuitive knowing, where information arrives like morning mist, quietly, mysteriously, without fanfare or explanation. It is the domain of the highly sensitive soul, who has always been a natural receiver of these unconscious transmissions. You are like a radio that can tune into frequencies others cannot even detect, picking up signals from the collective unconscious that speak of truths too deep for words, patterns too subtle for the crude instruments of rational analysis. But oh, how the world has taught you to doubt this gift. From childhood you were told that knowledge must come through approved channels, through books and teachers, through logic and proof. You were taught that anything arriving through intuition or feeling was suspect, untrustworthy, somehow less valid than information processed through the proper intellectual machinery. And so you learned to question the very capacity that is perhaps your greatest strength, to mistrust the inner knowing that has never led you astray when you dared to follow its guidance. The symphony of the unconscious plays in many movements, each one revealing a different aspect of this mysterious form of knowing. Sometimes it manifests as what others might call psychic ability, a sudden knowing about someone's emotional state, an inexplicable understanding of situations you have never encountered, a capacity to sense the undercurrents of group dynamics with startling accuracy. But these are not supernatural phenomena. They are the natural expressions of a psyche so finely tuned that it can detect the subtle emanations of the unconscious that surround us all like an invisible atmosphere. Consider how a musician can hear harmonies that escape the untrained ear, how an artist can perceive colors and shadows that others overlook, how a poet can sense the emotional resonance of words in ways that touch the soul. Your sensitivity works in much the same way, but instead of music or color or language, you are attuned to the psychological frequencies that vibrate through every human interaction, every emotional exchange, every unspoken communication that passes between souls. This capacity often manifests first in childhood, when the barriers between conscious and unconscious are naturally thinner. You may remember moments when you simply knew things you could not possibly know through ordinary means, when you sensed a visitor at the door before they knocked, when you felt the emotional state of a family member who was miles away, when you understood the unspoken tensions in a room full of adults who thought they were hiding their conflicts. These experiences, so natural and undeniable in their immediacy, were often met with dismissal or concern by those around you, teaching you to bury this gift beneath layers of rational doubt. But the unconscious symphony does not stop playing simply because we choose not to listen. It continues its mysterious melodies throughout our lives, offering guidance and wisdom to those who dare to trust its frequencies. Jung understood this when he wrote of the collective unconscious as a vast ocean of shared human experience, a realm where individual consciousness dissolves into something far greater and more profound. He recognized that those who could access this deeper layer of psychic reality were not deluded but gifted, not unstable but uniquely equipped to serve as bridges between the conscious and unconscious worlds. Your sensitivity makes you a natural inhabitant of this liminal space, this threshold between worlds where rational knowledge meets intuitive wisdom. You have always lived with one foot in ordinary reality and one in the mysterious depths of the psyche, and this dual citizenship has given you access to forms of understanding that are closed to those who dwell exclusively in either realm. It is why you can sometimes finish people's sentences before they speak them, why you can sense the emotional climate of a room within moments of entering it, why you can detect deception, not through logical analysis, but through a kind of psychic resonance that alerts you to the disharmony between truth and falsehood. This capacity for unconscious knowing operates through what Jung called the transcendent function, the bridge between conscious and unconscious content that allows previously hidden material to emerge into awareness. In you, this function is naturally active, constantly processing information that lies below the threshold of ordinary perception. You are like a deep-sea diver of the psyche, able to descend into depths where others cannot venture and return with treasures of insight and understanding that illuminate the human condition. But with this gift comes a particular form of suffering, for you often find yourself knowing things you would rather not know, sensing truths that others prefer to keep hidden, feeling the pain and joy of the world with an intensity that can be overwhelming. You have learned that ignorance is not bliss, but a luxury denied to those who hear the unconscious symphony too clearly to ignore its messages. This is the burden of the sensitive soul, to be awake in a world that often prefers to sleep, to see clearly in a realm where many choose blindness, to feel deeply in a culture that often demands numbness. Yet this burden is also your calling, for the world desperately needs those who can translate the wisdom of the unconscious into language that conscious minds can understand. You are the interpreters of dreams, the readers of souls, the ones who can sense what lies beneath the surface of human experience and give it voice. Your intuitive knowing serves not only your own growth, but the evolution of collective consciousness itself. For every time you trust your inner wisdom and act upon it, you demonstrate the validity of ways of knowing that transcend the limitations of rational thought alone. The symphony of the unconscious speaks in the language of symbols and metaphors, in feelings and images that bypass the rational mind and speak directly to the soul. You have always been fluent in this ancient tongue, able to decode the messages that arrive through dreams and synchronicities, through sudden insights and inexplicable knowing. This is why you may find yourself drawn to poetry and myth, to stories and symbols that resonate with truths too deep for literal expression. You recognize in these forms of communication the same quality that characterizes your own intuitive perceptions, a way of conveying meaning that transcends the boundaries of logical discourse. Your capacity for unconscious knowing also makes you exquisitely sensitive to the psychological dynamics of groups and relationships. You can feel the undercurrents of tension or harmony that flow beneath the surface of social interactions, sensing power struggles and emotional alliances that others remain oblivious to. This ability can make social situations particularly challenging, for you are constantly aware of layers of meaning and motivation that others prefer to ignore. You may find yourself exhausted by gatherings not because of their intensity, but because of your awareness of all the unspoken dramas playing out simultaneously. But this same capacity makes you invaluable as a healer, counselor, or guide for others on their own journeys of self-discovery. Your ability to perceive what lies hidden in the psyche allows you to help others uncover truths about themselves that they may have buried beneath years of conditioning and defense. You can sense where the deepest wounds lie, where the greatest potential for growth exists, where the soul longs to be free. This is not a skill that can be taught through textbooks or training programs. It is an art that flows from your natural attunement to the unconscious dimensions of human experience. The unconscious symphony also speaks through your body, which has always been your most sensitive instrument for detecting the subtle energies that surround you. You may have noticed how certain places or people affect you physically before you understand why intellectually, how your body responds to truth or deception, with sensations that precede conscious recognition. This somatic knowing is another expression of your capacity to tune into frequencies that others miss, to receive information through channels that bypass the rational mind entirely. Jung wrote extensively about the wisdom of the body, recognizing that our physical being often knows truths that consciousness has not yet accepted. In you, this body wisdom is particularly acute, manifesting as gut feelings, energy shifts, and physical responses to psychological realities that your mind may still be processing. Learning to trust these bodily messages is part of developing faith in your intuitive capacities, for the body never lies about the deeper truths it perceives. The symphony of the unconscious also plays through your dreams, which have likely been unusually vivid and meaningful throughout your life. You may have experienced prophetic dreams, healing dreams, or dreams that seem to carry messages from sources beyond your personal psyche. These nocturnal communications are another expression of your natural connection to the collective unconscious, where individual and universal wisdom converge in the mysterious theater of the sleeping mind. Your dreams often serve as a direct line to the unconscious, delivering insights and guidance that your waking mind might resist or dismiss. They speak in the symbolic language that you understand intuitively, weaving together personal material with archetypal themes that connect your individual experience to the larger patterns of human existence. Learning to honor and interpret these dream messages is part of developing trust in your intuitive knowing, for dreams never lie about the psychological realities they represent. As you mature in your understanding of this gift, you begin to recognize that what others might call psychic ability is actually a sophisticated form of psychological perception. You are not reading minds or predicting the future through supernatural means. You are picking up on subtle cues and patterns that reveal deeper truths about human nature and behavior. Your unconscious mind is constantly processing information that your conscious awareness cannot yet articulate, piecing together fragments of observation and insight into a coherent understanding that emerges as intuitive knowing. This process happens so quickly and seamlessly that it often seems mysterious even to you, but it is actually the natural functioning of a psyche that has learned to trust its deeper wisdom. Your unconscious has become a sophisticated pattern recognition system, able to detect connections and meanings that escape less sensitive observers. This is why your first impressions of people are often uncannily accurate, why you can sense the trajectory of situations before their outcomes become apparent to others, why you can feel the presence of possibilities and potentials that have not yet manifested in observable reality. The unconscious symphony also teaches you about the interconnectedness of all things, revealing how seemingly separate events and experiences are woven together by invisible threads of meaning and purpose. You have likely experienced synchronicities, meaningful coincidences that seem too perfect to be random, that confirm your sense of living in a universe where everything is connected at levels deeper than causality can explain. These synchronistic experiences are not supernatural phenomena, but evidence of your attunement to the underlying patterns that connect all consciousness. Jung wrote extensively about synchronicity as an acausal connecting principle, a way that the psyche organizes experience around meaning rather than cause and effect. Your sensitivity makes you particularly receptive to these synchronistic patterns, allowing you to perceive the hidden order that underlies the apparent chaos of daily life. This capacity can serve as a form of guidance, helping you navigate your path by attending to the meaningful coincidences that seem to point towards certain directions or choices. But perhaps the most profound aspect of the unconscious symphony is its capacity to reveal the deeper purpose and meaning of your life. As you learn to trust your intuitive knowing, you begin to sense not only what is but what wants to become, not only what exists but what is seeking to emerge. This forward-looking aspect of intuitive wisdom allows you to align yourself with the natural flow of your own becoming, to sense the direction in which your soul wants to grow and evolve. This prophetic dimension of your sensitivity is not about predicting specific events, but about perceiving the deeper currents of psychological and spiritual development that are always moving within you and around you. You can sense when someone is on the verge of a breakthrough, when a situation is ripe for transformation, when the time has come for hidden truths to emerge into the light. This capacity makes you a natural midwife for change, able to support others through the delicate process of growth and transformation. The unconscious symphony teaches you that knowledge comes in many forms, not all of which can be verified through conventional means. There is a knowing that emerges from stillness, a wisdom that arises from emptiness, an understanding that flows from the willingness to not know. Your sensitivity has likely taught you the value of this receptive stance, this openness to receiving truth from sources that cannot be controlled or commanded. You have learned to trust the process of unknowing, to create space for insights to emerge organically rather than forcing them through effort or will. This receptive quality of consciousness is particularly developed in sensitive souls, who have learned through necessity to listen more than they speak, to observe more than they act, to feel their way into understanding, rather than thinking their way toward truth. This contemplative approach to knowing has given you access to forms of wisdom that are closed to those who approach life only through analysis and action. You have become a vessel for deeper truths, a channel through which the unconscious can speak its ancient wisdom. As you learn to embrace this aspect of your nature fully, you discover that your intuitive knowing is not a burden to be carried, but a gift to be shared. The world desperately needs those who can hear the unconscious symphony, who can translate its subtle melodies into guidance and healing for others who have lost their way. Your sensitivity makes you a natural teacher and healer, not through what you know, but through what you can perceive and feel and sense in the moment-to-moment flow of experience. The unconscious symphony never stops playing, but learning to hear it clearly requires the cultivation of inner silence and receptivity. Your sensitivity naturally inclines you toward this contemplative stance, but developing it consciously allows you to become an even more skillful interpreter of the unconscious wisdom that flows through you. This means learning to quiet the rational mind when necessary, to create space for non-rational forms of knowing to emerge, to trust the process of insight and revelation that cannot be forced or controlled. In the depths of the unconscious, symphonies play that speak of truths too profound for words, of connections too subtle for rational analysis, of possibilities too vast for the linear mind to comprehend. You who can hear these mysterious melodies are the blessed and the burdened, the gifted and the challenged, the ones who carry the responsibility of translating the wisdom of the depths into language that the surface world can understand. Your intuitive knowing is not a supernatural ability, but a natural capacity developed through the refinement of sensitivity, the cultivation of receptivity, and the courage to trust in forms of wisdom that cannot be proven, but can always be felt. In the final movement of this vast psychological symphony, where all the themes and variations of sensitivity converge into a single harmonious resolution, we arrive at the sacred threshold of integration, that profound moment when the highly sensitive soul finally recognizes their nature, not as a cross to bear but as a crown to wear, not as a wound to heal but as a gift to honor, not as a burden to overcome but as a calling to fulfill. This is the culmination of what Jung called individuation, the psychological masterpiece in which all the scattered fragments of the personality, the shadows and the light, the wounds and the wisdom, the fears and the powers, unite into a coherent whole that transcends the sum of its parts. Like the ancient alchemist who spent lifetimes in pursuit of the philosopher's stone, believing it to be some external substance that could transform base metals into gold, the sensitive person often spends years searching outside themselves for the key to their transformation. They seek it in therapy and self-help books, in meditation practices and healing modalities, in the acceptance of others and the achievement of perfect emotional regulation, only to discover in the end that what they sought was never outside themselves at all. It was always their very sensitivity itself, their extraordinary capacity to feel and perceive and process the world with a depth and intensity that most can barely imagine. The integration of the sensitive self begins with a fundamental shift in perspective that can only be described as a kind of spiritual awakening. After years of viewing their sensitivity as a problem to be solved, a weakness to be strengthened, or a flaw to be corrected, they suddenly see it with entirely different eyes. Like the moment when an optical illusion reveals its hidden image, what once appeared to be limitation is revealed to be limitless potential. What once seemed like curse is recognized as blessing. What once felt like exile from the normal world is understood to be initiation into a more profound way of being human. This shift does not happen overnight, nor does it occur as the result of a single insight or experience. Rather, it emerges gradually through the accumulation of countless moments of recognition, moments when the sensitive person catches a glimpse of their true nature beyond the conditioning that taught them to see sensitivity as liability. Perhaps it comes in a moment when their emotional responsiveness helps a friend feel truly seen and understood. Perhaps it arrives when their aesthetic sensitivity creates something beautiful that moves others to tears. Perhaps it reveals itself when their capacity to feel deeply prevents them from making a choice that would have caused harm to themselves or others. Each of these moments contributes to a growing understanding that their sensitivity is not separate from their strength, but is their strength, not antithetical to their power, but is their power, not an obstacle to their authentic self-expression, but the very vehicle through which their truest gifts can emerge into the world. This understanding gradually builds until it reaches a critical mass, a point at which the old paradigm of sensitivity as problem simply cannot sustain itself any longer and collapses into the new paradigm of sensitivity as sacred endowment. The integration process requires the sensitive person to reclaim all the aspects of their nature that they may have rejected, suppressed, or tried to modify over the years. Their tendency to be easily overwhelmed must be recognized as the flip side of their capacity for profound absorption in beauty and meaning. Their emotional intensity must be embraced as the source of their extraordinary empathy and compassion. Their need for solitude and quiet must be honored as the necessary condition for their deep processing and creative incubation. Their difficulty with harsh environments must be understood as evidence of their attunement to subtlety and refinement. This reclamation is not a matter of simply accepting their limitations or resigning themselves to being different. Rather, it is an active process of discovering how each apparent weakness contains within it a hidden strength, how each challenge they face because of their sensitivity also opens doorways to possibilities that less sensitive individuals cannot access. The integrated sensitive person learns to work with their nature rather than against it, to design their life in ways that honor their needs while maximizing their contributions, to transform their supposed deficits into their greatest assets. The journey toward integration often requires a profound grieving process, grief for all the years spent trying to be someone they were not, grief for the opportunities missed while they were struggling against their own nature, grief for the harsh judgments they internalized about their sensitivity, grief for the ways they learned to hide their light and diminish their gifts to fit into spaces that were never designed to accommodate their true magnificence. This grief is necessary and healing, for it clears the way for a new relationship with themselves based on acceptance, appreciation, and authentic self-love. As this grief is processed and released, something remarkable begins to emerge in its place, a deep sense of coming home to themselves, a recognition that they have always been exactly who they were meant to be, a profound relief at no longer having to pretend to be different from their authentic nature. This homecoming is often accompanied by a surge of creative energy and authentic self-expression that has been suppressed for years, waiting for permission to emerge into the light of conscious acceptance. The integrated sensitive person discovers that their apparent contradictions, their need for both solitude and connection, their capacity for both vulnerability and strength, their tendency toward both perfectionism and acceptance, are not flaws in their design, but evidence of their psychological sophistication. They learn to hold these paradoxes consciously, to move fluidly between different states and responses as circumstances require, to embody what Jung called the transcendent function that unites opposites in creative synthesis. This integration transforms their relationship with their emotional intensity from one of fear and resistance to one of curiosity and appreciation. They begin to see their emotions not as chaotic forces that threaten to overwhelm them, but as sophisticated guidance systems that provide crucial information about their inner and outer environments. They develop what might be called emotional intelligence in its truest form, not the ability to control or suppress emotional responses, but the capacity to listen to emotions skillfully, to understand their messages, and to respond to them in ways that honor both their wisdom and their intensity. The integrated sensitive person also develops a radically different relationship with stimulation and overwhelm. Instead of seeing these as evidence of their inadequacy, they recognize them as signals that they are encountering more input than their system can process in the moment. Valuable information that helps them make conscious choices about their environment and activities. They learn to read these signals with the same respect they might give to physical pain that warns of injury, understanding that their sensitivity is not trying to limit them but to protect and guide them toward optimal functioning. This new understanding extends to their relationship with others as well. The integrated sensitive person no longer feels obligated to explain or justify their needs, to apologize for their intensity, or to minimize their gifts to make others comfortable. They develop healthy boundaries that protect their energy while remaining open to meaningful connection. They learn to distinguish between people who appreciate their sensitivity and those who are threatened by it, gravitating naturally toward relationships that nourish rather than drain their authentic nature. Perhaps most importantly, the integrated sensitive person begins to recognize their role in the larger ecosystem of human consciousness. They understand that their sensitivity serves not just their personal development, but the evolution of collective awareness. They see themselves as early warning systems for toxic environments, as bridges between different states of consciousness, as translators of subtle information that helps communities navigate complex emotional and spiritual territories. This recognition brings with it a profound sense of purpose and meaning that transcends personal fulfillment. The integrated sensitive person realizes that their struggles with sensitivity have been preparing them for a form of service that requires exactly their combination of depth, perception, and emotional courage. They may become healers, artists, teachers, counselors, or leaders, or they may serve in quieter ways, simply by embodying in their daily lives the possibility of living with greater consciousness, compassion, and authentic self-expression. The integration process also involves a complete reframe of what it means to be successful and powerful as a sensitive person. The old paradigms of success based on competition, dominance, and the ability to function effectively in high-stimulation environments are replaced by new understandings of power that honor the sensitive person's natural gifts. They discover that their power lies not in their ability to be like everyone else, but in their willingness to be uniquely themselves, not in their capacity to withstand whatever life throws at them, but in their skill at creating conditions that allow their gifts to flourish. This reframed understanding of power is deeply feminine in nature, regardless of the sensitive person's gender. It is the power of receptivity, rather than aggression, of depth rather than surface, of quality rather than quantity, of being rather than doing. The integrated sensitive person learns to wield this power consciously and skillfully, recognizing it as no less effective than more traditionally masculine forms of power, simply different in its expression and application. As integration deepens, the sensitive person often experiences what can only be described as a flowering of their authentic gifts. Freed from the energy drain of constantly fighting against their nature, they discover reserves of creativity, intuition, and emotional intelligence that they never knew they possessed. Their capacity for deep feeling becomes a source of profound wisdom about the human condition. Their attunement to subtlety becomes a superpower for detecting truth, beauty, and meaning in all its forms. Their need for processing time becomes the foundation for insights and creations that could emerge in no other way. This flowering is not just personal but interpersonal as well. The integrated sensitive person often discovers that they have become a magnet for others who are struggling with their own sensitivity, who recognize in them a model of what becomes possible when sensitivity is fully embraced rather than resisted. They become mentors and guides, not through preaching or teaching, but simply through the example of their own integrated presence. The integrated sensitive person also develops a sophisticated understanding of their own rhythms and cycles. They learn to honor their need for alternating periods of engagement and withdrawal, stimulation and rest, giving and receiving. They design their lives to accommodate these natural rhythms, rather than forcing themselves to maintain a constant level of activity or availability. This self-knowledge allows them to sustain their energy and effectiveness over the long term, preventing the burnout that often affects sensitive individuals who have not yet learned to work with rather than against their nature. Perhaps one of the most beautiful aspects of integration is how it transforms the sensitive person's relationship with their past struggles. The years of feeling different, misunderstood, or overwhelmed are no longer seen as time wasted or trauma to be overcome, but as essential preparation for their current capacity to serve others who face similar challenges. Their wounds become their wisdom, their struggles become their strength, their sensitivity becomes their superpower. This transformation of perspective extends to their understanding of difficulty and challenge as well. The integrated sensitive person recognizes that their intense responses to life's difficulties are not evidence of weakness, but indicators of their capacity for profound engagement with existence itself. They understand that their tears, their overwhelm, their need for retreat are all part of a sophisticated system for processing the full spectrum of human experience with unprecedented depth and authenticity. The integration of sensitivity also involves a mature understanding of the relationship between individual development and collective service. The integrated sensitive person recognizes that their personal healing and growth are not self-indulgent pursuits, but necessary preparations for their capacity to contribute meaningfully to the world. They understand that they cannot give what they do not have, that they cannot guide others to places they have not been themselves, that their commitment to their own integration is simultaneously an act of service to the larger whole. This understanding brings a kind of sacred purpose to every aspect of their self-care and personal development. Meditation becomes not just stress relief, but preparation for deeper service. Therapy becomes not just personal healing, but training for understanding the healing process. Creative expression becomes not just personal fulfillment, but a way of bringing beauty and meaning into a world that desperately needs both. As integration reaches its fullest expression, the sensitive person often experiences what Jung described as the emergence of the self, that transpersonal aspect of the psyche that transcends the individual ego while including it. This self expresses itself through the unique constellation of gifts and characteristics that define the individual's authentic nature, but it serves purposes that extend far beyond personal satisfaction or achievement. The self of the integrated sensitive person might express itself as an artist whose work awakens others to beauty they had forgotten was possible, as a therapist whose presence creates space for healing that seemed impossible. as a teacher whose sensitivity to their students' needs enables learning that transforms lives, as a parent whose emotional attunement helps their children develop healthy relationships with their own feelings, or simply as a human being whose way of moving through the world reminds others that gentleness and strength are not opposites, but partners in the dance of authentic living. This emergence of the self also brings with it a profound sense of peace with one's place in the world. The integrated sensitive person no longer feels like they are swimming against the current of life, but rather like they have found their natural element and learned to move within it with grace and purpose. They understand that their sensitivity is not a mistake or accident, but an essential contribution to the vast symphony of human consciousness, a unique note that adds depth and richness to the collective song. The integration journey culminates in what can only be called a celebration of sensitivity, not the defensiveness of someone trying to justify their differences, but the quiet confidence of someone who has discovered their authentic power and learned to wield it in service of love. This celebration is visible in how they carry themselves, how they speak about their needs and gifts, how they approach challenges and opportunities, how they relate to others both sensitive and non-sensitive. In this final integration, the sensitive person becomes a bridge between worlds, between the harsh realities of external existence and the subtle truths of inner experience, between the practical demands of daily life and the sacred dimensions that give life meaning, between the wounded and the healed, between those who have forgotten their sensitivity and those who are just beginning to remember it. They become living proof that it is possible to be both sensitive and strong, both gentle and powerful, both deeply feeling and highly functional. The individuated sensitive person stands as a testament to the possibility of authentic living in a world that often seems to reward conformity over authenticity, surface over depth, speed over contemplation. They demonstrate through their very presence that another way is possible, a way of being human that honors the full spectrum of consciousness, that makes space for the tender and the profound, that recognizes sensitivity not as weakness, but as one of humanity's greatest gifts to itself. In the end, the integration of the sensitive self reveals the profound truth that Jung intuited in his understanding of individuation, that the goal of psychological development is not to become someone different from who we are, but to become fully and authentically who we have always been beneath the layers of conditioning, adaptation, and compromise. For the sensitive person, this means embracing their sensitivity so completely that it transforms from limitation to liberation, from burden to blessing, from curse to calling. This transformation is both personal and transpersonal, both individual and collective, both healing and prophetic. It heals the wounds that sensitivity has carried in a culture that often fails to understand its value, and it prophesies a future in which sensitivity will be recognized as one of the essential capacities needed for humanity's continued evolution toward greater consciousness, compassion, and wisdom. The sensitive person who has achieved this integration becomes a seed of possibility, a living demonstration of what becomes available when we stop trying to be normal and start learning to be magnificent. When we cease trying to fit in and begin to stand out in service of something greater than ourselves, when we transform our sensitivity from a source of suffering into a source of strength that serves not just our own becoming, but the becoming of the world itself.